Chapter 159. How could magic be so inconvenient? Regulus paid no attention to the Kella novel reading feast slogans plastered around. Massive books, ultimate experience. Over the past 3 days, he had slept less than 6 hours, but the imprint in his consciousness was sharpening. The mandrake's tendency toward decomposition was no longer an abstract magical quality. It was becoming tangible. It felt like carving a groove in his mental landscape. 10 could flow along that channel, and by the time it emerged, it already carried the trait. In the early hours of the fourth day, Regulus left the greenhouse. A sea breeze caught at his collar as he walked along the stone path toward the eastern side of the Seven, where a nest of gnomes lived beneath the base of the eastern wall. He squatted and reached into the burrow. His fingertips met warm, rough skin that still twitched. He pulled one out. The gnome twisted desperately in his hand, its short legs kicking wildly, emitting a piercing sound somewhere between a scream and a cough. Regulus held it by the scruff. It did not calm like a cat. These things were pests, useful only for cheap glove linings or as food for certain picky magical beasts, perfect for testing 10. Back in Greenhouse 3, he set the gnome on the edge of an empty planting trough. It tried to run, so he used a levitation charm to lift it free of the ground. Its 4 feet beat the air furiously. He drew 10 from the 6th mandrake. After 3 days of practice, his extraction had become noticeably more efficient. The moment his fingertips touched the leaf, 10 slid back along the channel he had been carving, steady and continuous. In a short time, 3 spheres of grayish-green light hovered in his palm, their rims sending out ripples too fine for the naked eye to see. He merged the 3 drops into one. The pooled 10 grew slightly, no larger than a small fingernail. Regulus guided the drop and pressed it to the gnome. The gnome stopped mid-struggle the instant the 10 made contact. It was not the instant rigidity of a petrificus totalis, nor the limpness of a stupefy. It simply lost the will to move. Then, decomposition began. It started at the point of contact. The patch of skin lost its color, but it did not turn white or gray. It lost all the visual characteristics that made skin skin: texture, sheen, elasticity, even clear boundaries. The area blurred into something between existence and non-existence, and the edges spread outward. Where the mandrake's influence passed, skin ceased to be skin. The stratum corneum, the granular layer, the basal layer, those layered structures that form the organ of skin, simultaneously lost their definition. They became a loose collection of protein fibers, lipid molecules, and melanin granules, no longer bound into a functional tissue. The skin vanished without blood spilling. Blood itself, once a whole of cells, plasma proteins, and electrolytes, had its internal connections severed. Blood cells became fragments of membrane holding heme. Plasma became only water and dissolved solutes. Nothing was destroyed in the conventional sense. Cells did not burst, molecular chains were not snapped, chemical bonds were not forcibly torn. The components simply ceased to form a coherent whole. Beneath, muscle was exposed. Striated skeletal muscle fibers, once neatly aligned multinucleated cells filled with ordered myofibrils, blurred and then lost their structure. Actin and myosin filaments no longer interlocked. They were long-chain protein polymers floating in cytoplasm. Tendons and cartilage followed, and finally bone. The gnome's body unraveled from the outside in, losing order in a systematic, clinical way. All the matter that had constituted the creature remained in place in its most primitive state. In the end, only a small pinch of dust-like residue remained on the edge of the trough. This was the most thorough reduction. Regulus crouched staring at that pinch of ash. A mature mandrake's cry could be fatal, but a victim's corpse remained intact. Skin would still be skin, flesh still flesh, bone still bone, only lifeless. The mandrake's natural curse ended at killing. What he had just done was different. He had extracted in an instant the 10 this mandrake would have released slowly over decades. That quantitative change had crossed an invisible threshold. Where the cry could only kill, he had undone the very definition of a whole. He looked down at his palm. The 10 had dissipated without a trace. He realized what he had done. He had removed the foundation of a living being's existence. If life is a building, the killing curse is like taking out the load-bearing walls and watching the structure collapse into rubble. His method was worse. It made bricks no longer bricks, cement no longer cement, steel no longer steel. Not even rubble remained. He swept the ash into an empty flower pot and sat quietly. He had succeeded, but there was no triumph. Extracting a mandrake's decomposition tendency and casting it independently was only the first step. It was far from the finish line. This method was not sustainable. Was he expected to carry a mandrake everywhere he might need decomposition tone? 10. If an emergency erupted during a duel or battle, did he imagine the enemy would wait while he extracted essence? It felt less like magic and more like handicraft, powerful and delicate, but utterly impractical. The House of Black could likely supply him with an endless stock of mandrakes, but that would be a waste of time, effort, and resources. He could extract and store 10 in specialized containers, like a witcher with a belt of numbered vials, unscrewing one and tossing it before a fight, but that was only a stopgap. It was like going into battle with a gun and a finite supply of bullets. Once they were gone, the weapon was just a piece of metal. How could 10 be so inconvenient? Night lay thick over the greenhouse. Clouds hid the moon. The eastern horizon was only a faint gray line. There was still time before dawn. Regulus inhaled the salty air, let it fill his lungs, and returned to the planting trough. 20 mandrakes remained in their pots. 6 had already died from magical exhaustion. He sat down. Extraction had proved that the effect existed. Now he had to understand it. He had to take the decomposition tendency apart, map its texture, and learn every turn. He placed his hand on the leaf of the 7th mandrake and began again. This time he was not after quantity, but precision. He pushed his magic perception to its limit, condensing his 10 into extremely fine threads that tracked backward along the extraction path. The mandrake's magical circuits opened in his consciousness with a clarity he hadn't had 3 days before. Then he found the core, the gateway through which all 10 became stamped with decomposition. His magical tendrils circled the core without touching it. He observed, he watched how 10 flowed in, how it circulated inside, and how it emerged carrying a new attribute. The entrance and the exit were different. What flowed in was neutral life 10. What flowed out was already altered. He began to carve every detail of that process into his mind. The position of the entrance, the exit angle, the number of loops in the internal circuit, the speed of the flow. Then he tried to reproduce it inside the blank space of his consciousness, building a miniature model. Failure. The model would not turn. The 10 entered, stopped at the entrance, and refused to move forward. Regulus adjusted angles, widened channels, altered flow rates. The 10 went an inch and stalled. He enlarged the input channel. The mandrake's core was wider than he'd thought. Try again. The 10 flowed in, completed a loop, and emerged, but it did not carry the decomposition trait. He dismantled the model and started over. By the time he had fully extracted the 10 from the 7th mandrake, he still hadn't succeeded. The 8th, the 9th, failure after failure. He did not panic. After each attempt, he compared his model to the real core. Sometimes the circuit was half a loop short, sometimes the flow was too fast, sometimes the entrance angle was off. With the 10th plant, he began recording the magical fluctuations as 10 circulated inside the core. With the 11th, he finally made his models 10 bear the decomposition attribute at 1/10 the concentration of the original. The 12th reached 1/3, the 13th 1/2. On the 14th, he withdrew his hand from the leaf and paused. Something hovered in front of him. Chapter 160. This is the spell. It was a structure made entirely of 16, suspended in the air and turning slowly before him. About 8 inches across and irregularly shaped, it resembled an exaggerated plant root system, abstract but unmistakably organic. Countless threads of 16E wove together into a mesh, a thick, bright main stem, numerous fine branches, and tips that split into innumerable hair-like filaments. Every strand flowed. 16 poured in at the entrance, followed a preset path, and after 7.5 rotations flowed out the exit. The 16 that came out carried a grayish-green tint. Disintegration. Regulus stared at it. He had spent 9 days using the 16 of 20 mandrakes and dozens of failed prototypes to replicate the mandrake's 16 cycle exactly. He could now assemble that structure with his own 16 whenever he wanted. When 6 flowed in and then out, it bore the mandrake's disintegration attribute. No plants, no extraction, no preliminary preparation. His own 16 was the raw material. He pushed open the greenhouse door. Outside, it was still the middle of the night. It was early July, and the days were hot, but a cool sea breeze came in from the east. Regulus walked along the stone path toward the eastern side of the levin. The gnome nest sat at the base of the eastern wall. Gnomes were nocturnal, and fresh tracks ringed the entrance. Tiny footprints and a few tufts of coarse brown hair rubbed off on the edge. Regulus squatted and raised his right hand, palm toward the nest. Magic flowed up from inside him and unfolded along the preset path above his palm. In less than 2 seconds, the 16 structure he had spent 9 days reproducing sprang to life in the night. It glowed with a grayish-green light, fine ripples spreading from its edges across the darkness. He continued to feed 16 into it. The mandrake's method of attack used sound waves as a carrier and 16 as the core. He had no need for a carrier now. He released the core directly. The grayish-green light in the air flared for less than half a second. In the gnome nest beneath his feet, a dozen or so signatures went out at once. Those weak pulsations, the 16 fluctuations belonging to living things, fell instantly silent. Regulus withdrew his hand. The grayish-green glow dissipated into the night breeze, leaving nothing but the rhythm of the waves slapping the reefs. It had taken him half a year to go from conceiving the space sleep spell to perfecting it. From his first encounter with Fiendfire to precisely controlling 3 firebirds had taken 3 months. And the whole argument about 3, from conception to acquiring the natural magic inheritance to this moment of verification, had spanned his entire first year at Hogwarts. He felt a light, clear rush of excitement. His continuous investment had finally paid off. He let it linger for a heartbeat, then let it go. The work wasn't finished. Understanding and reproducing the effect was only the end of the research phase. He wanted to make it into a spell, something he could call at will without rebuilding the 16 structure in place. Just like Space Sleep, he wanted disintegration to be immediate and effortless. Back in Greenhouse 3, all 20 mandrakes were dead. Leaves drooped and curled, roots shriveled and wrinkled. Their humanoid shapes left only faint indentations. They lay half-fallen over the edge of the planter like emptied specimens. Regulus sat by the window with his back to the corpses and sank his consciousness inward. Star tracks fanned out in his mental world. The starlight of 4.5 stars swept across his awareness, dispelling the fatigue and exhilaration of the last 9 days and clearing his mind. He reviewed how Space Leap had come from nothing. At first, he only knew house elves could do it, and that the principle was folding space so 2 points touched. There was no ready incantation or standard gesture. He had produced the effect first and reverse-engineered the process from the result. This would be similar and simpler. He already had the result and experience in developing spells. He needed only to reverse-engineer a spell framework that reliably reproduced the effect. He opened his eyes. The sky outside was still dark. The eastern wind was cool. He began defining the boundaries of this magical act. It worked on the structure of being itself, severing the link between whole and parts. Its core image was loosening a structure that had already formed. He needed a Latin root that carried that image precisely. He searched memory. Redo, return, restore, solvo to loosen, untie, release, dissolvo to completely loosen, to disintegrate. He repeated it silently, feeling the syllables in his mouth. Dissolvo, 3 syllables, stress on the second, vowels open enough, clipped so it would not muffle in rapid casting. This was it. The gesture, Space Leap, used a single-handed arc with the 7 to represent the fold of space. But this wasn't folding. It was loosening and disintegration. It didn't need an elaborate trajectory, just a clear motion pointing at the target. He reached out his right hand, slid the scene into it, faced an empty corner of wall, pressed his wrist down, and angled the smenin diagonally toward the floor, as if pressing something into dust. Simple and definite. With the incantation and standard gesture set, all that remained was to let the 16 complete itself. Dumbledore had said, needed blank space, do what was necessary, and then leave room for the 16 to breathe. Regulus closed his eyes and reconstructed the mandrake's 16 cycle in his head. He opened his eyes, raised his 17, flicked the tip downward, and said, "Dissolvo." The spell structure formed faster and smoother than he expected. The threads found their places, the mesh adjusted to the right scale, grayish-green light pooled at the edges, and then, complete. He held the posture and repeated once more, "Dissolvo." This time every detail was clear. The syllables triggered the solidified 16 model in his mind. 16 flowed from the 17 and ran the preset circuit, releasing with the disintegration attribute. He wasn't manipulating the 16 to do anything. He only laid the track, and the 16 ran it and fell away at the finish. That was a spell. He lowered the 7. Dawn had begun to pale the eastern horizon to pale gold. He had sat here all night. Outside, he cast the spell on a newly dug gnome in the levum. The creature stiffened the instant the grayish-green light touched it, then disintegrated, skin to bone, outside in, losing order in a precise collapse. It took 0.3 seconds. For living organic targets, the spell took 0.2 to 0.5 seconds to act, varying with size and 6-9 resistance. Next, he tested on inorganic matter, a fist-sized chunk of granite from the wall's base. Dissolvo. The grayish-green ray struck the rock. A fingernail-sized flake peeled off with ragged edges. He fired 3 more times and left 3 shallow pits, the deepest half an inch at most. The spell was extremely inefficient against inorganic matter. He then tried a magical artifact, an old 13 from storage engraved with a defensive charm. He hit it with 6 full-power casts. The surface dimmed briefly and then recovered, essentially ineffective against established Table 16 constructs. The testing concluded. He had produced the first form of the disintegration curse, standard casting, sem-pointed, single-syllable trigger, grayish-green beam, producing disintegration on organic living beings upon impact. A shield charm could defend effectively against it. He began modifying it. The mandrake's disintegration was transmitted by its cry. Though he now released the core directly, a carrier had advantages. Sound ignored cover, could affect an area, and if you couldn't hear it, you wouldn't know to defend. Regulus spent 6 hours in the corner of the greenhouse, overlaying his 16 model with the physics of sound waves. The mandrake's howl was physiological, so he made the 16 model generate vibration while operating. 3 hours to make it vibrate, 2 hours to tune the frequency below human hearing, under 20 Hz. 12. He cast the spell at the remains of a dead mandrake. An invisible ripple rolled through the air, struck the wall, reflected, and dissipated. He couldn't hear it and didn't want to, but he could perceive the grayish-green disintegration attribute carried in that ripple. He recorded this as the second form, low-frequency sound transmission. Area of effect, directionless and visually undetectable. A shield charm could weaken it, but not fully block it. The sound wave would penetrate the barrier, though the barrier would blunt the harmful 16. A person hit without protection would likely die. He hadn't tested it on a living human, so certainty eluded him. He lowered his 17. 9 days to understand the mandrake's disintegration, another day to turn it into 2 spells, one visible, one invisible. One a ray for pinpoint lethality, the other a ripple that silently swept the field. Both sprang from that single plant, from one drop of 16 and a pinch of ash. He had completed an advanced application of natural magic, observation, replication, creation, closed and whole. It summed up his conceptions from the past year. Still, it wasn't enough. He had copied the mandrake's disintegration perfectly and could call it at will without a mandrake. But it remained the mandrake's power, not his. Its scenarios were limited, tailored to organic life, barely touching inorganic matter, impotent against magical constructs. On a battlefield, a single shield charm could render it harmless. This was not what he wanted. Regulus wanted more than to replicate the mandrake's effect. He wanted to understand decomposition itself and then surpass it. He didn't just want the mandrake's particular way of breaking things down. He wanted the principle behind decomposition in all its forms. Erosion and weathering strip rock into rubble and gravel. That is decomposition. When a spell's precise magical circuits are severed by an outside force and the charm collapses back into raw components, that is decomposition. When an organism's tissues fail, organs stop coordinating, and a living body becomes a corpse. That, too, is decomposition. When the magical imprint on a family heirloom is erased and it returns to ordinary metal and wood, that is decomposition as well. He wanted a universal logic that could account for all of these. Relying on the mandrake alone was not enough. He needed decomposition itself. He looked up out the window. The night had gone utterly black. Sea and sky blended into one in the distance so that you couldn't tell where water ended and atmosphere began. Only a few scattered stars punctured the clouds, small and eternal. He thought of Betelgeuse, the red supergiant 700 million times the sun's volume, 640 light-years away. Its light takes 640 years to reach Earth. What he saw then was how the star had looked 6 centuries ago. Even the stars change. They burn hydrogen, then helium, then heavier elements for millions, tens of millions, even billions of years until their fuel runs out. Low-mass stars swell into red giants and shed their outer layers. Massive stars pile up iron in their cores until gravity wins. The core collapses and rebounds, and a supernova explodes, the brilliance momentarily outshining the whole galaxy, scattering heavy elements into space. Those elements float for eons, are gathered by gravity, and condense into new stars and planets. The iron in Earth's core came from a supernova billions of years ago. Every metal trinket on his person was made from atoms born in such an explosion, flung into space, captured, and finally mined out of the Earth. Even stars end. Order becomes chaos, and gravity reorders the chaos into new order. Isn't that decomposition too? Let existing structures loosen. Let crystallized energy flow again. Let something return to a state where it can be redefined. The mandrake's magic was a form of decomposition. It used 7.5-turn magical circuits to channel raw life energy, making whatever it touched lose its definition of whole. Stellar death is decomposition too. Gravitational collapse severs the binding energy between nuclei, so the iron core disintegrates in a fraction of a second, returning matter accumulated over eons to the universe. One is the path of magic, the other the rule of physics, separated by 640 light-years, by 6 billion years, and by the conceptual divide wizards and muggles have drawn between magic and science. But the underlying logic is the same. Return order to chaos so chaos can be given a new order. The sea breeze off the east carried a chill. He wanted to replicate stellar collapse in a spell, though that might be beyond the domain of any wizard. Still, he could borrow the perspective. The mandrake's effect made skin cease to be skin, flesh cease to be flesh, bone cease to be bone. A star's death makes iron cease to be iron, silicon cease to be silicon, oxygen cease to be oxygen. What he wanted was a spell that could return any formed thing to the state before it had been organized. Plants did it, so did gravity and time and the laws of physics. Could magical circuits do it? He had no proof, only a strong desire to try. He planted that idea deep in his mind. It was too large to tackle all at once, an ultimate vision to realize slowly. For now, perfectly replicating the mandrake's decomposition magic was a milestone in itself. At the least, the pathway of natural magic had been cleared, or rather, he had cut a new trail. His development of natural magic ran in a different direction from the Eldrin ancestors. Once he understood the method, acquiring the properties of other magical plants would be a matter of repeating the same process. Understand, replicate, transform into his own. As for the disintegration curse itself, once he had finished developing it, he no longer needed the incantation. The wand could be put away. He could cast it with a simple motion of his hand, silently and wandlessly, devoid of preliminary flourish. Among the spells he had mastered, this was almost the most terrifying. The effect was directly lethal. It reduced an organism from a whole to fragments, from existence to non-existence. If the Ministry's classifications were strict, the disintegration curse and the killing curse would sit side by side. Yet it didn't require strong negative emotions, at least not for him. When he cast it, all he held in his head was the magical circuit model, the logical structure of decomposition. There was no hatred, no murderous intent to be summoned. It felt like operating a machine on an assembly line. Set the parameters, and the result came. The killing curse demanded true murderous will. The Patronus charm needed the happiest memory to feed its silver light. The disintegration curse required understanding. He had to carve that abstract concept of making a whole no longer whole into his consciousness until it was as natural as breathing, then encode it into the magical circuit model so the model itself carried the attribute of decomposition. This spell reached an extraordinary degree of completion. But unlike Space Leap, which could be taught playing key points and letting someone emulate the incantation and wand work, the disintegration curse imposed an unavoidable threshold. You had to construct that mental model. Not just any magical circuit would do. The model Regulus had built took 9 days, the lives of 20 mandrakes, and uncounted failures and adjustments to perfect. Every entrance angle, the position of the main branches, the curvature of the 7.5-turn circuit, the width of the exit, each had to match the mandrake's internal logic. Off by a single degree, the circuit would allow energy in and not let it out. Half a turn's difference produced only ordinary magic with no special attribute. A mispositioned branch made the model collapse on itself. He had used his mind to replicate the core circuitry of a complex organism. The required precision was perversely exacting. And replication was only the first step. Harder still was making it instinctive, ready to be deployed in an instant. If he wanted to teach someone else, he realized the problem. The student would first have to understand decomposition, to make the whole into many isolated parts, to return order toward its primitive chaos. This was not something easily conveyed in words. He could show them the mandrake, demonstrate the effect, but whether they truly grasped it depended on them. Only with that understanding could the abstract concept of decomposition infiltrate each thread of the magical circuit model when they constructed it. This, he thought, should be the standard for high-level magic, not just correct words and wand work, but the proper mental condition. The killing curse needed murderous intent, the Patronus charm needed joy, occlumency required emotional separation from thought, the disintegration curse required an objective comprehension of an abstract principle. Regulus suspected that would be difficult for most wizards. Their education taught them to tie magic to emotion. Anger brightened fire, sorrow warped water, happiness strengthened a Patronus. Asking them to adopt a calm, analytical understanding and embed it into the heart of a magical circuit might be asking too much. He had never encountered other spells quite like the disintegration curse and did not know whether any precedent existed in the wizarding world. Perhaps ancient magic used similar modes, but modern magical education had long since abandoned this approach. He could let his father try. Chapter 162, Blue Cheese, Infested with Maggots. Regulus stood, leaving the window behind. Before he left, he took one last look at the row of planting troughs where the remains of 20 mandrakes still lay. Agnes would take care of them. He pushed open the greenhouse door and walked back toward the main house. Upstairs, he opened his room and collapsed onto the bed. 10 days. In total, he'd slept less than 20 hours. Even with his mental toughness and physical strength, exhaustion seeped from every cell. Star orbit meditation could restore energy, but it couldn't replace sleep. Some things had to be replenished the old-fashioned way. He closed his eyes and consciousness sank into darkness. When he opened them again, the sky outside was bright. He lay staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling for a while, that heavy, satisfied feeling that follows a long, uninterrupted sleep settling through his limbs. He moved his fingers and felt his magical energy flowing smoothly through his body with no stagnation. He got up, washed, and changed into fresh clothes. Agnes was in the kitchen of one of the small houses, using her wand to make a pile of carrots peel themselves. When she saw him, she set the wand down and turned. "Mr. Black, are you leaving?" "Yes," Regulus nodded. "Thank you for your help these past few days." A peaceful smile spread over Agnes's face, deepening the wrinkles around her eyes. "It's nothing, just delivering meals. I couldn't do much else." Regulus took a small cloth bag from his pocket and set it on the stove. Inside were 30 galleons, considerably more than the usual charge for room and board. He wasn't compensating for the lost mandrakes. He felt Agnes's work deserved payment. She glanced at the bag, but neither refused it nor counted it. "Next time you come, tell me in advance, and I'll tidy up the east greenhouse." "I will," Regulus said. "Goodbye." Then he left. He apparated to the entrance of 12 Grimald Place. He steadied himself, drew his wand, and tapped the door. It opened at the sound. The portraits in the great hall were dozing, a few lifting their eyelids to glance at him before drooping again. He went upstairs, took a long shower to wash away the salt air he'd carried for 10 days, and changed into a dark gray lounge robe of soft fabric. He went down to his father's study and knocked. "Come in." Orion sat behind the desk with a document in hand. He looked up at Regulus. "You're back." "Yes." Orion set the paper down and leaned back, his gaze on Regulus different than usual. There was a kind of anticipation there. "How did the magic go?" Regulus heard the interest in his father's voice. Orion knew why he'd gone to the plantation: natural magic and mandrakes. In Orion's view, mandrakes had unquestionable medicinal value, but were of limited combat utility. Their cries were loud but defendable with a shield charm, earplugs, or a bubblehead charm, and a potted plant was an awkward weapon. Wizards had long since experimented with mandrakes. Toss one while an enemy clamped their ears and strike. But few adults were ever killed directly by one. That only made Orion more curious. He trusted his son wouldn't repeat well-worn tricks, and for the past 6 months he'd watched Regulus's projects with eager expectation. Even common things, he thought, became interesting once Regulus touched them. Regulus met his father's look and nodded. "It's finished." The corners of his mouth lifted faintly. It met expectations. Orion's eyebrows twitched. He fell silent for a moment, eyes asking the unspoken, "Show me." He wondered what Regulus had done, an ear-piercing shriek that stunned outright, a directional effect that didn't require uprooting the mandrake. Regulus didn't answer with words. He raised a hand and twitched his fingers. Orion felt it immediately. As a skilled wizard, his sensitivity to magical fluctuations far outstripped most people's. The slightest twitch sent a spell rippling from Regulus, silent, invisible, without color or light, yet undeniably there. The spell propagated outward from him with remarkable speed. Sound being its medium, it traveled at roughly 340 meters per second. The ripple reached Orion, penetrated his skin, and seeped into his flesh, limbs, and bones. At first, it was a subtle wrongness, an indescribable discomfort like having eaten something bad. A thought flickered through his mind, like eating a piece of blue cheese crawling with maggots. Nausea rose. He wanted to vomit, but couldn't. For a moment he thought this was it, merely unpleasant, no real damage. If Regulus had spent 10 days to produce only this, then truly. Then the sensation intensified. It wasn't because Regulus had strengthened it. The ripple had reflected off the study's walls and overlapped with the spell still in Orion's body. The amplitude after overlap grew, the magical energy increased, and the nausea doubled. Orion understood in an instant. In an enclosed space, the spell would bounce and accumulate. If confined long enough in a small room, the effect could, in theory, be amplified indefinitely. He began running tactical scenarios through his head, luring an opponent into a narrow chamber, combining it with a sealing spell, creating a trap. Before he finished thinking, Regulus raised the output. Orion's nausea shifted into dizziness, like too many broom rides or the vertigo after 3 consecutive apparitions. The room swayed, his balance dulled, his mind felt thick as if filled with bad potion. He remembered, in his youth, apparating 5 times in pursuit of an enemy and collapsing on landing, taking 10 minutes to crawl upright. That was the feeling now. The reflections kept adding up. After 3 overlaps, the dizziness was hard to ignore. Orion's magical energy began to condense automatically, the instinctive reaction of a practiced wizard under continuous assault. He noticed himself preparing a shield charm. Regulus pushed the intensity further. The sensation changed again. Beyond nausea and dizziness, there was violent shaking, like being boxed in an iron chest while someone pounded the outside with a sledgehammer. Internal organs, brain, eyes felt as if they were being rattled. It wasn't overtly painful so much as the body felt as if it were coming apart. Orion's expression altered. This thing, he realized, could do real harm. He raised his hand. Before his wand could fully move, a shield charm unfurled, translucent and immediate. The sound waves struck it. Most of the magical energy was blocked, only a lesser portion penetrating the barrier. But the shield charm wasn't airtight like a bubblehead charm. It couldn't isolate the air, and therefore it couldn't stop vibration. Sound was merely the medium, but the effect targeted the whole body. The ripple passed through and still affected him, though weakened. Orion sat back in his chair, breathing heavy. Regulus relaxed his hand, and the spell dissipated. The sound waves in the study vanished in a heartbeat, the air's faint tremor settling quickly. Orion stayed motionless for several seconds, brow furrowed and lips pressed, swallowing down the nausea. He let out a long, slow breath and then cast a simple healing charm on himself to ease the dizziness and settle his stomach. After a few more moments, he looked up at Regulus. His expression was complicated. Curiosity, calculation, and something close to reluctant admiration mingled in his eyes. Orion wasn't angry. He trusted his son's sense of propriety and didn't think Regulus would actually harm him. Besides, this was nothing. Regulus had once cast Crucio at him and missed, and Orion had been hit by one himself in return. It was roughhousing between father and son, mostly in jest. Having lived as long as he had, Orion had seen plenty of bizarre things. His reaction was a mixture of, "This is a little sinister," and "as expected of my son." This spell, his voice was a little hoarse. He cleared his throat and went on. "It's very unusual. Because he was a highly skilled wizard, Orion could sense the spell when it was cast. If an ordinary witch or an inexperienced duelist had been struck by Regulus's version, they might not have even had the strength to raise their wand. Before they could see an attacker or hear an incantation, their body would go wrong. Nausea, vertigo, loss of balance. By the time they realized they needed to defend themselves, it would be too late. Orion watched Regulus, his expression returning to its usual reserve, and gave a measured nod. "Not bad," he said flatly. "A powerful spell." Regulus's smile broadened. "Father, that was only the minimum power. I controlled it carefully." Minimum? Orion's eyebrows rose. He remembered the sensation. The first level had been devastating, nausea and dizziness at the scale of a mature mandrake's cry, which could fell several adult wizards if they were unprepared. But what he'd felt in that last instance had shaken his mind as if it were coming apart, at a level even a mandrake could not reach. And yet Regulus called it the minimum. "What happens at maximum?" Orion asked. Regulus's smile widened. "At maximum, if you weren't prepared or didn't deliberately defend yourself, it would likely be fatal." Orion fell silent for a moment, then nodded at him to continue. Regulus explained, calmly and precisely, the full nature of the disintegration curse, its particular effect on living tissue, what happened on impact, skin ceasing to be skin, flesh ceasing to be flesh, bone no longer bone, until only a handful of basic elemental residue remained. He described two forms of the spell. The one just demonstrated was the second form, a low-frequency sonic propagation, an area of effect strike with no visible signs. The first form was the conventional, single-point variant, precise and lethal, which a shield charm could stop depending on the skill of the caster and the refinement of the spell. The second form, the sonic, was harder to defend against. A shield charm might only weaken it, while only a full-body bubble could isolate it entirely. Regulus added that he had tuned the frequency below human hearing, making it inaudible. As Orion listened, his face grew serious. With his years of experience, he recognized the sophistication of the spell. Its destructive power was obvious. It lacked only one trait to be comparable to the killing curse. But the killing curse announced itself with that unmistakable green light visible from a distance. Regulus's second form was soundless and lightless. A target might never know what hit them until they were dead. In practical terms, it could be more devastating. Where the killing curse was single target, Regulus's sonic form could wipe out any number of living things caught in its radius. Orion ran through the dark arts he knew and had seen. There were few things to compare with this. He looked up at his son. Regulus sat composed, eyes clear, showing none of the exhilaration or caution one might expect after creating such a potent dark spell. It was as if he had merely demonstrated a newly learned scouring charm. Orion remained silent. Regulus broke the quiet. "Father, I'd like to ask a favor," Regulus said. Orion's eyebrows rose. This was the first time his son had asked for help. He listened. "Speak." "I'd like you to try to learn it," Regulus said. "Help me test how difficult it is to learn this spell." Orion blinked, then understood. Regulus had developed the spell himself, and now wanted Orion to take it on, not to have it taught in the usual sense, but to act as a test subject for its learnability. There was something softening in Orion's eyes. A discovery like this could easily become a guarded family secret, passed only to heirs. Regulus had been unusually open, demonstrating, explaining incantations, wand movements, and the logic behind the casting in the study. Orion had been moved by that alone. He fell silent for a moment, then nodded. Regulus straightened. First, the conditions. This isn't like space leap. With space leap, once you understand the principle, speak the words, and move your wand correctly, practice makes it work. The disintegration curse, however, has an unavoidable threshold. You must construct a mental model, he said. Orion nodded, signaling him to continue. He knew about mental constructs. Some ancient spells demanded building a complex image in the mind first, ready to be called on in casting. Regulus lifted his hand, and with his fingertips tapping in the air, produced a quick mental projection, a mandrake core, gray-green and vivid. I spent 9 days creating this by completely replicating a mandrake's core structure. He expanded the model from 8 inches to a foot so Orion could see, pointing out key nodes and critical parameters. Orion watched the projection, the seriousness in his face deepening. Building a mental model wasn't impossible. The challenge was constructing an unfamiliar one with painstaking precision. That required exceptional control of magic, something Orion possessed. But Regulus went on, and Orion realized there was more. The hardest part, Regulus said, is understanding decomposition. Decomposition? Orion echoed. Regulus considered an analogy and pointed to the mahogany desk between them. This desk, before casting, it's a desk. After casting, it is still wood, nails, lacquer. But they no longer form the whole we recognize as desk. The definition of desk has been revoked. Make the whole no longer whole, he added. Orion frowned. That sounds like philosophy, Regulus agreed. But it's something you must understand when casting. The deeper your understanding, the more smoothly the model operates, and the more powerful the spell. Without that understanding, no matter how precise the model, what you produce is just an ordinary spell. He lifted his hand and held it, doing nothing else. When I cast it just now, there was no killing intent, no malice to summon. There was only one thought: loosen the structure of existence, let order return to chaos. Orion was quiet for a long time. He understood the words, but he couldn't see how to translate that abstract notion into workable magical logic. Too many pieces were missing. He looked at Regulus and slowly shook his head. I think I understand what you mean, but to turn it into something I could actually cast. Regulus read the expression on his father's face and understood. That kind of abstraction was difficult for traditional wizards. The pure-blood world of Orion had been raised on straightforward magical education. A spell equaled an effect. Chant the right words, move the wand correctly, and it worked. For spells that required emotion, you summoned it. For those that didn't, you followed procedure. There had never been a need to grasp something like making the whole no longer whole. Regulus thought, for a moment, of his muggle-born classmates, of Lily, and whether someone like her might find the concept easier to grasp. He didn't say that aloud. Chapter 164, Freya, the German Witch. I'll write down the key points and my understanding, Regulus said simply. It will stay at home. Anyone who wants to learn it later can read it themselves. Orion looked at him and nodded. There was a complex look in his eyes, as if he were seeing the family's future in the sun before him, reaching in ways he had never imagined. At that moment, the study door connecting to the adjoining rooms opened. Gerald Hawke stepped out first, the hem of his robes dust-streaked. He looked up, saw Regulus, and gave a casual nod. Young Mr. Black. Mr. Hawke, Regulus replied politely. Hawke turned to Orion. Mr. Black, Sirius's training has reached a stopping point, he said flatly. He has basically mastered the fundamentals of this branch of magic and can use it very well now. Orion signaled him to continue. Hawke added with a trace of genuine admiration, Mr. Black, I must say again, the blood of House Black is truly... He stopped, searching for words. Highly talented, very high. Orion glanced at Regulus. Then he exchanged a few polite words with Hawke, thanked him for his hard work over the period, and said future arrangements would follow. Hawke nodded and took his leave. The door closed. For a few seconds, the study fell quiet as father and son looked at each other. Hawke had called Sirius highly talented, and he was right. Among the young wizards Hawke had seen, Sirius would rank near the top. But Hawke didn't know what a truly talented person looked like. The one who, moments earlier in the study, had used an invisible, wandless, silent spell that nearly knocked the head of House Black from his seat, was standing right there and calling Hawk Mr. Hawk. Neither father nor son spoke, but both wore a hint of a smile. A moment later, the connecting door opened again, and Sirius came out. He walked as though on cotton, each step uncertain. He had to lean against the doorframe to steady himself. His robes bore scorch marks, edges curled and blackened, one shoulder missing fabric entirely. A lock of hair was singed and clumped, smelling faintly of burnt hair. His face was smudged pitch black, sweat and soot mixed so that his skin tone was barely visible. When he saw Regulus seated there, his body went rigid. It was an instinctive movement. He didn't want to look pitiable in front of Regulus, even though Regulus had seen him in worse states, some of which had been Regulus's doing. Sirius withdrew the hand, bracing him against the wall, and let it fall to his side, trying to stand straight though his knees trembled. He opened his mouth, words forming. "Regulus, where have you been these last few days? Regulus, are you off groveling at Voldemort's heels like Bellatrix? Regulus, do you know how out of control Walburga has been while you were away?" But the words stuck. He simply stood and stared at Regulus, and Regulus stared back. Neither spoke. Finally, Sirius averted his gaze and continued forward, each step painfully slow but without leaning again, until he left the study and the door shut behind him. Orion and Regulus watched him go in silence. After a few seconds, Regulus broke his gaze. "Father, I'm going back." Orion didn't reply until Regulus rose to leave. "Will you continue practicing this branch of magic next?" Regulus paused, then shook his head. "No need. Magic must be practiced. The path of any discipline is vast, and there are always higher peaks." Of course, he would keep improving, but he no longer needed to hide away alone to research in secret. The disintegration curse was developed. He was proficient in space leap. His control over fiendfire was stable. He'd achieved almost everything he'd set out to do over the holidays, except for star orbit meditation. What came next was to test these things in real combat, to see whether his discoveries held up in uncertain, dangerous situations, and to find an opportunity to light up Wriggle. Orion studied his face a moment longer, and then nodded. "Rest at home for a week. There are arrangements for next week." Regulus inclined his head. "All right." He left, his steps steady until he disappeared behind the door. On an early morning in mid-July, after breakfast, Orion took Regulus to the drawing room in the east wing, a room seldom used except for important guests. A fire burned in the hearth, and an oil painting of a North Sea storm hung on the wall, giant waves and a faintly visible sailing ship battling the surf. They sat on the sofa near the window. Soon Creature pushed open the door, followed by another figure. "Master, little master, the guest has arrived," the house elf intoned. Regulus looked up. The visitor was a striking woman. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, as straight and sturdy as a young oak. Her platinum blonde hair was tightly braided at the back with not a stray strand out of place. Her features were sharp, a high-bridged nose, a strong jawline, eyes that were calm and piercing. She wore a hunter's outfit in deep gray, expertly tailored and belted at the waist, leather pads on the shoulders, muscle rippled beneath the fabric. She carried herself with the compact, restrained power of someone used to action. Handsome, valiant, and cool, she looked about 25 or 26. A steady, powerful aura of magic surrounded her. It wasn't flashy, but any perceptive wizard would recognize that she was formidable. Orion rose. "Freya von Eisenhart." He turned to Regulus. "This is Regulus." Regulus stood and gave a slight bow. He knew the Eisenhart name. A German pure-blood house of prominence in the Nordic wizarding world, its status comparable to House Black in Britain. The House of Eisenhart controlled much of the cultivation and trade of magical pearls in the North Sea, had deep ties within the German Ministry of Magic, and had intermarried with several ancient German and Austrian families for generations. Regulus had read their entry in the foreign archives in the family library, their history traced back to the 13th century. Unlike British pure-blood houses, Eisenhart did not court publicity. Their style was restrained and pragmatic. Their motto, "Actions before words," echoed through every generation, calm, efficient, decisive. When Grindelwald rose, the House of Eisenhart declared neutrality, but not the opportunistic neutrality of cowards. They managed to stay out of the conflict by skillful diplomacy and quiet firmness. Grindelwald's people had tried to use North Sea routes for transport and were politely rebuffed with a generous gift to save face. A subtle understanding followed: no cooperation, no hostility, no interference. After the war, there was no evidence they had taken part in acolyte activities, so they were not purged. Investigators could only conclude they had maintained strict neutrality. Regulus knew this history and admired it. In an era of stark black and white, keeping oneself clean required more than strength. It required brilliant political judgment. The German pure-blood philosophy differed from the British. British houses prized blood purity, social ceremony, and the airs of an old empire. Their contempt for muggles sat alongside a flamboyant aristocratic style. Germans valued strength and capability. Blood mattered, but more important was whether one could shoulder family duties and make the right choices when it counted. Marriages consolidated power rather than performed purity rituals. The contrast had been shaped by history: Britain's insular aristocratic traditions versus Germany's place in the heart of Europe, where dealing with shifting powers bred a pragmatic, efficient outlook. Regulus's gaze lingered on Freya as these thoughts passed through his mind. Freya stood there and let him look her over. There was no discomfort in her eyes. Her gaze was fixed on him, but it was difficult to read. There was scrutiny. There was suspicion. That was normal. Regulus knew he was only 12. Freya had come all the way from Germany, and with the family mission Orion had mentioned, it was clear the two families intended to cooperate. There were only 3 people present. It certainly wasn't going to be Orion himself out in the field, which left only him, a child. On first meeting, anyone would doubt whether he could be of any help. But there was something else he couldn't quite name. Beyond the inspection and suspicion, there was a look that suggested she knew him. Not the sort of recognition that came from hearing the name of the heir to the House of Black. This felt more specific, as if she recognized him personally, the sort of person he was, the sort of things he might do, perhaps even things he had done recently. That was wrong. Regulus was certain he had never met her. If she truly knew him, it could only be through other means, family intelligence files or the like. As heir to the House of Black, his name and basic information had probably been in the dossiers of the major European pureblood families for years. It made sense Freya had looked him up before coming. It still left him with a strange, unsettled feeling he couldn't explain. The expression in her eyes softened. She gave a slight nod. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Black." Her voice was low and clear with a distinct German accent. The R's were a little heavy, but every syllable was crisp. "Nice to meet you, Miss von Eisenhardt," Regulus replied. He stood 3 or 4 steps away. Up close, the height difference was obvious. He was about 1.68 meters tall for his age. Star orbit meditation had accelerated his physical development compared to other wizards. Still, in front of Freya, he was almost 20 centimeters shorter. He had to tilt his head up to meet her eyes while she looked down at him. Orion spoke from the side in an even tone. "The House of Eisenhardt's Pearl Farm and observation station in the North Sea have been harassed by an organization." His voice betrayed no urgency. "The attackers belong to the Abyssal Whisper. They are trying to obtain an ancient maritime document kept by the House of Eisenhardt. The harassment is professional and targeted. It isn't ordinary piracy." He looked at Regulus. Freya needs a sharp-minded, unconventional assistant to help with investigation and deterrence. Regulus listened and nodded. Orion continued, "This is your first field mission. It's also diplomatic. The House of Eisenhardt and the House of Black have been on good terms for generations. This cooperation is a perfect training opportunity for you." Regulus understood. It was both fieldwork and diplomacy. Help an ally solve a problem while showing them the caliber of the House of Black's heir in person. But one question arose at once. Why would the House of Eisenhardt need to ask the House of Black for help? Eisenhardt's status in Germany matched House of Black's in Britain. They were deep-rooted, well-connected, and quite powerful. If the Abyssal Whisper posed a threat serious enough to require foreign aid, they had closer German allies and could dispatch powerful wizards from within their own family. They wouldn't have to come to Britain to recruit a 12-year-old. Regulus ran through possibilities. Either the abyssal whisper issue wasn't as simple as Orion had presented. Perhaps the theft of documents was only the surface of a more complicated matter involving higher-level politics or something inconvenient to handle on German soil. Or this was simply a social maneuver, a networking opportunity for the young heirs to work together, build personal ties, and create future channels of cooperation. If they got along, later exchanges could deepen. If not, no harm done. Everyone would go home without owing anything. It would preserve face, leave no traces, give the youngsters experience, and pave the way for future collaboration. He looked at Freya. She looked back. Her expression was unreadable, and her suspicion hadn't vanished. Regulus didn't mind. Suspicion was the easiest thing to dispel. Time and action would show whether he could be trusted. Talking now would only seem like childish boasting. Better to wait for the right moment. "Let's go," Freya said to Orion. "Mr. Black, if it's convenient." Orion nodded. Freya took a small object from her pocket, a silver seashell the size of a palm. A portkey. She handed it to Regulus. "Activate it at the front door in 5 minutes. I'll go outside and wait." She turned and left the drawing room. Regulus took the seashell. It was cold and smooth in his hand. Orion patted his shoulder. "Remember, you represent the House of Black." Regulus nodded and followed. Outside 12 Grimmauld Place. Freya waited at the bottom of the steps with her back to them. The summer breeze teased the ends of her braids. Hearing his footsteps, she didn't turn, only looked up at the overcast sky. Regulus came down and stood beside her. They waited in silence. After a few minutes, the seashell warmed in his palm. A force grabbed at his navel and pulled him forward. 12 Grimmauld Place melted into a blur of light. On landing, Regulus bent his knees to absorb the impact. Beneath his feet was rough rock, damp with seawater. He steadied himself and looked around. They stood at the edge of a cliff. Behind them rose rolling hills of dark green shrubs, with a few trees bent by the sea wind. The cliff fell away abruptly beneath them. Dozens of meters below the sea was gray-blue and roaring as waves smashed against reefs. Low, dense clouds scudded across the sky in broken, flocculent shapes. The light was dim. He couldn't tell whether it was morning or afternoon. He breathed in. The air was thick with salt and fishiness, mingled with the scent of algae. It was not like the sea in Cornwall, whose breezes were gentler and damply embracing. Here the wind was colder and harsher, scraping his face like fine sandpaper. Far out, a few reef islands loomed as black silhouettes in the mist. Beyond them, the sea and sky blended into one endless gray. "Reef Town," Freya said at his side. Regulus turned. She, too, was watching the distant horizon. "Northern Germany, near the North Sea, 50 kilometers from the nearest Muggle town. There's an apparition restriction zone. Entry and exit depend mainly on portkeys and broomsticks. The permanent population is about 300, most of them employees and family of the House of Eisenhardt." Regulus nodded and resumed his watch across the water. Freya stood at the cliff's edge like a statue. The wind whipped her clothes, but she didn't move. He knew the name Abyssal Whisper. He had skimmed files on foreign dark organizations in the family library. The Abyssal Whisper was a secretive, ancient, highly elite international dark wizard society. They worshipped the deep sea and pursued forbidden knowledge tied to the ocean, lost civilizations, ancient spells, and certain non-human things that lived beneath the waves. There were few members, but each was an expert. They operated quietly, never flashy. Their aim was to obtain specific ancient relics or knowledge, not to sow terror or amass wealth. Regulus asked, "Just the two of us?" Freya glanced at him. "Just us. Others are covering other locations. This is the primary point. They've struck 3 times in the last month." She paused, then added, "No more people are needed." Her English carried a pronounced German accent, flat-toned and precisely enunciated, matching her cold, upright bearing. There was a contrast between the exactness of her words and the lack of warmth in her voice. "The place to stay has been arranged," she said, looking down at him and catching only the top of his head. "Follow me." She turned and walked along a narrow path that led down the cliff. Gravel crunched under her boots. Regulus followed. The path wound among low shrubs and rocks until a cluster of buildings came into view. Low stone houses with black roofs and narrow windows, built to withstand the North Sea storms. The houses clung to the coastline, and in the distance a few tall turrets rose, their lamps flickering at the tops. "You stay in the one by the sea," Freya said, pointing to the house closest to the cliff edge. 2 stories, its stone walls bleached white by salt and wind, windows tightly shuttered, a thin ribbon of smoke curling from the chimney. "It's close to mine." Regulus followed Freya along the gravel path, his footsteps crunching behind hers. She walked with her back straight, each step sure and even, a platinum braid swinging gently behind her. Even among Caucasians, she was tall. He watched her shoulders move, the way her hungear outlined the lean lines of her muscles, and a dozen thoughts turned over in his head. On the surface, this mission looked simple enough. The Abyssal Whisper was old, elitist, devoted to the deep sea and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. They had fixed their sights on ancient maritime documents kept by the House of Eisenhart and were pressuring the family into handing them over through constant attacks and harassment. Freya had told him they had infiltrated farms, ambushed patrols, and struck observation posts, every action with a purpose, probing defenses, gathering intelligence, leaving a mark. So far, their tactics were more pressure than outright assault. No massacre, no frontal assault, just a long, grinding strategy meant to make the cost of keeping the documents higher than the cost of surrendering them. The House of Eisenhart, Freya said, refused to back down. Regulus understood why. This was not mere pride. These documents were valuable in ways beyond reputation. Lost trade routes, hidden treasures, components for ancient rituals. Who knew what they contained? After guarding them for generations, the Eisenharts could not be expected to hand them over lightly, and showing weakness now would invite worse predation later. The struggle between pureblood houses and powerful dark wizard groups was, in a way, a war of attrition. Once you opened the door, you invited more hands in. Only the 2 of them were in Reef Town. Other Eisenhart members were posted elsewhere. Freya had said as much. That meant the Abyssal Whisper were applying pressure on multiple fronts, looking for the weakest link. Freya had also said 2 people would be enough. In her eyes, Regulus was still a 12-year-old. She probably didn't expect him to help much, maybe even assumed he'd be a liability. For her to be confident with only them showed how sure she was of her own abilities. The Abyssal Whisper were no ragtag gang. They were listed among international dark wizard organizations. They had history, structure, and real capability. They worked the sea all year and were experts in maritime combat and water-based magic. Dealing with them would not be easy, but Freya walked like someone who welcomed difficulty. Regulus felt the pulse of power around her. Dense, focused, controlled. Her center of gravity was steady. The shape of her body suggested more training than simple classroom study. She had clearly been trained for combat. Regulus even judged she wouldn't be helpless if she lost the ability to cast spells. His mouth twitched at the coincidence, just like me. He found her presence magnetic in a different way from the usual kind. Freya's charisma wasn't soft or coquettish. It was sharp and tough. Height, a warrior's carriage, angular features, efficient manner, quiet self-assurance. Kids might find her intimidating. Adults found her arresting. He didn't know quite how to put it, but he liked it. Freya must have sensed him looking. She stopped, turned, and their eyes met. It was a simple, unstudied motion, no drama, no searching expression. She just looked. Regulus held her gaze for a few seconds. She did not speak. It was as though she were waiting for him to explain himself. He couldn't tell her what he'd been thinking. That would be rude, and he had to keep his composure. He looked out toward the sea for a beat, then back at her. "Miss von Eisenhart," he said evenly, "do you know more about the Abyssal Whisper?" He was genuinely curious. Their obsession with the deep, with forbidden sea knowledge and lost civilizations, set them apart from ordinary dark wizard groups who chased power or wealth. The Abyssal Whisper seemed to have an ideology, a goal, a philosophy, and that made them interesting. Freya slowed so he could fall in beside her. Her voice was low and deliberate, the German edge shaping her words. "They worship the deep," she said. "They believe knowledge should be like the ocean, objective, vast, and capable of swallowing the noise of individuals." She kept her gaze on the path. "They are experts in the dark arts, mental erosion, and ritual magic. Above all, they are dangerous at sea." She frowned, the expression serious. "Their magic has a peculiar quality. It isn't the raging malevolence of common dark spells. It's cold." She glanced at him, then continued. Like the abyss itself, neither good nor evil without feeling. It simply is. It consumes. Regulus listened. If you encounter them, Freya said, looking straight ahead again, protect your mind first, your body second. Their aim isn't always to kill, she went on. They will make you forget why you should resist. They will make you feel resistance is pointless, that nothing matters. That confirmed his suspicion. Mental erosion. Regulus nodded. When you say they're skilled at maritime combat, what does that mean in practice? They walked a few steps before she answered. On the sea, they move faster. Their spells increase in power. It's a bad idea to fight them on open water. She pushed a wind-blown strand of hair behind her ear and stopped to face him squarely. Pay attention to mental defense. A shield charm won't stop mental erosion. Regulus felt the implied warning. Freya didn't say it outright, but he could tell she doubted a child could withstand that kind of assault. He didn't mind. If he were in her position with a 12-year-old assistant, he'd be wary too. Still, he was eager. Abyssal whisper, mental erosion, maritime strength. He wanted to know how his star orbit meditation and mental barriers would hold up, and that cold, consuming magic, how did it compare to the disintegration curse he'd been working on? Freya seemed to accept his quiet attention as understanding and resumed the tour. They circled Reef Town along the coastline while she pointed out key locations, the protective boundary around the Pearl Farm, the entrance to the deep-sea observation station, usual patrol routes, and the town's blind spots. Her briefing was concise and efficient. Every sentence contained what he needed to know. How large is the coverage area of the protective wards? He asked. If someone infiltrated from under the sea, how deep can the detection charms reach? In the last 3 attacks, which direction did they retreat? Each question made Freya look at him a little longer. Her first impression had been that his steady demeanor might hide inexperience. Now his questions showed serious thinking. She still didn't expect him to contribute much in a fight. 12 years old, no matter how talented, but she began to treat him as someone who might actually be paying attention rather than slacking off. When they finished the circuit, they returned to the stone house by the sea. The light was low, and the wind carried salt and the briny scent of the ocean, and Regulus felt the pulse of the town, and the threat that hovered over it, settle into a quiet, waiting hum. Chapter 167, Sudden Battle. Freya stopped and looked down at him briefly. Rest first. At 8 tonight, I'll come get you for patrol. Regulus nodded. Freya turned and walked away, her stride brisk as ever, quickly disappearing around the corner of another house. He pushed open the door to the shelter. The interior was larger than he'd expected. The ground floor held a sitting room and a kitchen, a fire crackling in the hearth. A narrow staircase led up to the bedroom, whose window faced the sea, offering a view of the gray-blue water and the silhouette of Reef Island on the horizon. He climbed the stairs and stood at the window. Out on the surface, a few gulls drifted, circling low. He replayed Freya's words in his head. Their goal isn't to kill you. They'll make you forget why you're resisting. It was a striking idea. Most battle magic was straightforward: damage, control, or death. The abyssal whisper, however, attacked the will to fight itself, and that was far more dangerous than a physical wound. A wizard who was hurt could keep fighting if their will remained. But if you took away the will, even a perfect body was useless. Regulus tried to imagine how such a thing worked. Illusions? Emotional contagion? A curse aimed at consciousness? He stood at the window thinking until the sky darkened. At 8 sharp, Freya knocked on the door. Regulus opened it. She had changed into a dark, form-fitting hunting outfit with a waterproof cloak thrown over her shoulders. Her wand was tucked into a leather holster at her waist. "Let's go," she said, standing in the doorway without coming inside. Her voice was low and steady. Regulus remained in his clothes, but pulled his wand and tapped his chest, murmuring a waterproofing charm. They slipped out and began their patrol along the route they'd taken that afternoon. Reef Town was quiet at night, the only sound the dull, endless crash of waves against rock. No moon showed, clouds lay heavy and flat, and only a few pinpricks of starlight leaked through before being swallowed again. Freya walked ahead with her usual long, silent strides. Regulus followed, matching her caution. They made a circuit around the perimeter of the town without finding anything unusual, then headed for the stone tower on the shore. The tower was domed, its walls slick with dark green seaweed. Firelight danced at the top. The heavy door stood closed, panels carved with complex protective runes that glowed faintly blue in the dark. Freya stopped in front of the door. She slid her wand into her palm, but did not raise it. She motioned for Regulus to stay put, then reached out and touched a particular rune on the door. It flared briefly and went dark. She stepped back and shook her head. "It hasn't been disturbed," she whispered. The wind caught her hair, but her voice stayed clear. Regulus watched the runes a moment. They had a different character from the protective marks he'd seen in Britain. British runes favored complexity and elegance, swirling lines and layered isolation. These runes had a Germanic austerity, straight, sharp strokes and geometric connections between nodes. It read like a logical, dynamic defense, one that would analyze the magical signature of anyone trying to enter and decide whether to bar them, admit them, or raise an alarm. Not better or worse, just a different style. They continued north along the rocky shore. The stones here were strangely shaped, worn smooth by the sea. When they reached the middle of the rocks, Freya suddenly halted. She raised a hand, stop, then turned slowly, scanning the area. Regulus felt it too, a faint ripple of magic, subtle as undercurrents. 3 distinct sources, scattered in different directions among the rocks. Freya said nothing. She brought her wand to her chest, tip angled slightly down in a fighting stance. Regulus drew his own wand. 3 figures stepped from behind the rocks. Dark gray robes clung to them, soaked through. Bone masks carved with twisted runes glowed dimly. They took positions in a triangle, surrounding Freya and Regulus. The only sound was the surf. Then Freya acted. A quick flick of her wand sent a silent stupefy streaking at the figure on the left. The masked man was ready. He lifted a palm and a translucent barrier sprang up, taking the blow. Ripples ran across its surface and smoothed. The middle masked man spoke then, his voice strange and hollow, as if echoing from some great depth. "Eisenhart," Freya cut him off with another flick. 3 spells went out almost at once, each aimed at one of the masked figures. Regulus wasn't idle. He aimed his wand at the masked man on the right and unleashed the first form of the disintegration curse. The gray-green bolt was silent and swift, sinister against the dark. The man on the right misjudged the speed and barely dodged. The curse nicked the corner of his robe at the left shoulder. Where it touched, the cloth instantly disintegrated, exposing skin. A gray-green mark bloomed, and then collapse began. The skin itself seemed to fall apart into fine, colorless particles in a heartbeat. Muscle beneath lost its texture and shriveled, as if its substance were being siphoned into dust. Bone showed faintly. The disintegration curse did what it promised. It revoked the cohesive definition of those tissues and reduced them to primitive constituent units. The process was terrifyingly clean and fast. But the masked man reacted with equal speed. He raised his wand to the wound, and a dark red light flared at its tip, an almost boiling, self-consuming sort of magic. The red light washed over the damaged area and the surrounding flesh. The left shoulder was stripped away and vaporized in an instant, rising as a wisp of black smoke. What remained was a concave, charred pit held together by a thin strip of flesh. Then the light shifted from dark red to a clear, icy blue. New tissue, bright red granulation, grew visibly from the wound's edges and wove itself together, filling the cavity. Skin slid across and closed. Seconds later, the shoulder was whole again, a patch of glossy pink flesh catching what little light there was. He moved the arm. The joints clicked faintly. Regulus frowned. The disintegration curse had worked, but the opponent had responded by surgically excising the eroded area and then regenerating it. He treated his own body as expendable. Damage could be cut away and replaced. The curse had completed its destructive work. The man had simply chosen to discard the result along with damaged vessel. The middle masked man spoke again. "A boy. Interesting." There was curiosity in the echo of his voice. Freya gave them no more words. She raised her wand and chanted a tongue-twisting incantation at high speed. Moisture in the air condensed into a dozen transparent ice spears, each tipped razor-sharp and shimmering with magic. With a flick, she launched them in unison. All 3 masked men moved together. The one on the left tapped his wand and enlarged a shield to intercept. The middle man spread his fingers and made a grasping motion at the incoming spears. They twisted in midair, collided with each other, and shattered into a spray of glassy shards. The injured man on the right lunged straight at Regulus, his speed unnaturally quick, as if he were sliding across the rock like ice. Regulus braced himself, wand up, as the triangle tightened, and the night filled with the sound of breaking ice and the howl of the sea. Regulus did not retreat. He raised his wand, and a shield charm bloomed before him, translucent, crystalline in texture. The masked man charged the barrier. His right hand was a fist wrapped in a dark blue glow. He struck the shield with a single brutal punch. The shield charm shuddered violently. Dense ripples ran across its surface, but it did not break. The defense had held, just as Regulus expected, but the attacker's style left him slightly unsettled. He could feel the power behind that blow. The physical impact was real and unusually strong. Yet that wasn't the main reason the shield had trembled so much. The real threat was bound to the fist itself. The magical energy attached to it was thick, heavy, and incredibly penetrating, seemingly designed to tear through shield charms. This was a fighting method far removed from mainstream wizardry, directly infusing limbs with condensed magical energy or spell effects and using them in close combat. Regulus had imagined such an approach, but never actually seen it in practice. It felt archaic, efficient, simple, and utterly dependent on the wielder's control of their own body and magical energy. Modern wizards rarely fought this way. Wands amplified magic, making spells easier, stronger, longer-ranged, and safer. Attaching raw energy to fists was inefficient, risky, and normally countered by anyone competent at ranged magic. The wizards of the Abyssal Whisper clearly did not care, or rather, this was their system, primitive, direct, corrosive. The realization flashed through him and was gone as Regulus answered. His own magical energy stirred under his feet, and a fist-sized stone tore free from the ground. The transfiguration completed as it detached, a 15-centimeter-long spike, dense and jagged with a cruelly sharp tip. It began to spin, immediately reaching its limit. The friction with the air heated the surface until it glowed dark red, then white-hot, and a high, piercing hiss filled the night. Heat shimmered the air. The red light danced. It was faster, hotter, and more lethal than the version he had shown Hermes. Regulus tapped his left index finger. The air rippled. Space leap. He vanished with the spike. It reappeared without warning less than 3 inches behind the masked man's head, having no flight path or visible approach, as if it had always been there. The masked man felt the aura of death at once and was about to react. Regulus used the opening. He brought his wand to bear again, this time the first form of the disintegration curse. Since this was its combat debut, it had to land. The disintegration curse killed on impact, yes, but it could be dodged. Spells were dodged all the time. If he missed, he would try again. The point was to score a hit. The masked man had been impressed by Regulus's first attack. At first, he'd assumed the boy was just that, young, composed, but inexperienced. But that gray-green spell had grazed his robe, and the fabric had instantly vanished. He assumed it had merely burned the cloth away, until he felt something wrong in his left shoulder, a hole where flesh should have been. Looking down, he saw a sunken patch beneath the torn clothing. Skin and muscle were gone, as if they'd never existed. Faint fragments of collarbone were visible through a thin layer of tissue. He had endured decades of dark arts, cruciatus, cruel human hexes, blood curses, yet he had never seen anything like that. It caused no pain, no impact. It simply erased part of him. He severed the shoulder to let it regenerate, then marked the boy as dangerous. His close-quarters punch had failed as well. He had spent years honing that move, concentrating his magical energy into the fist to smash fragile shield charms, but Regulus's barrier had been unnaturally solid. The punch only made the shield vibrate. Just as he reconsidered his tactic, something lethal struck from behind his head. It was unimaginably fast and arrived without warning, its heat scorching his scalp. He didn't turn. Turning would be too late. His body dropped sharply as instinct drove him to protect himself, and his magical energy surged. A mass of water condensed from the air behind him, but it was wrong, transparent yet viscous, heavy, writhing as though alive. It bore an oily sheen, and every ripple carried a dull compression. The attack behind his head was physical, so he blocked it physically. He had not even time to form a proper spell. He used his magical energy to condense a substance from the air with a density far beyond normal liquid. Under force, it would harden. The spinning spike struck the fluid with a screech. The red glow on the spike flickered. Ripples ran over the fluid like a creature in agony. Heat vaporized clouds of white steam. The hissing was ear-piercing. The spike stopped less than half an inch from the back of his skull. It did not penetrate. Still, the masked man did not turn. He kept his gaze locked on the boy, because compared to the threat behind him, the boy in front was the real danger. The child's expression was unnervingly calm. He scanned the battlefield with peripheral vision as if everything lay under his control. The masked man retreated, then retreated again. He raised his own shield charm and poured his magical energy into it, reinforcing the translucent barrier to its limit. He watched the tip of Regulus's wand flare with gray-green light and tensed every muscle, holding his breath against the incoming assault. He knew that radiance, that spell's terror, and if he had failed to act when he did, he would already be dead. The gray-green light shot from Regulus's wand. The masked man braced for impact, and then the light vanished. Just before it reached his shield, the gray-green radiance simply disappeared as if it had never existed. The masked man blinked in confusion, and then felt it. A piece of his chest was gone. He looked down and watched, unable to look away. The skin in a small patch was changing, losing its form, turning into tiny separated particles that drifted away. Beneath, muscle blurred and crumbled into finer dust. The ribs showed through, and their surfaces disintegrated into a gray-white powder. Organs were revealed and then dissolved. His vision swam. He tried to raise his hand, to cast, to do anything, but his body betrayed him. The barrier fell away, and his wand slid from numb fingers. The spell's afterimage still flickered in his eyes, dimming fast. At the last instant, he met Regulus's gaze. The boy stood with calm composure, the wand's tip leveled at him, doing nothing more. The disintegration spread. From that spot on his chest outward, skin, sinew, bone, organs, everything returned to a primitive state with horrifying speed. The whole process took less than half a second. When it finished, nothing remained but a small pinch of ash that the sea breeze scattered. A grown man, alive a heartbeat ago, was gone. The field fell abruptly silent. The crash of waves against the reefs came forward in sudden clarity. Freya and the two other masked men stopped almost at the same time and looked over. All that remained was a pinch of ash scattering on the sea breeze, drifting down into the reef crevices. The two masked men stood frozen where they were. Freya stood frozen too. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Regulus noticed a change in Freya's face. Her eyes widened just a little. Her pupils tightened, her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Astonishment. A 12-year-old had used a single spell to turn a living person into a handful of ash. Freya's reaction was natural, and Regulus found it oddly entertaining. He let the corner of his mouth lift. The disintegration curse had debuted perfectly. He was satisfied. The spell had cost 3,000 galleons in research and development, 10 days of intensive study, and countless failures. In those last days, he had pushed himself to the limit. The price had been high, but the result justified it. This was the first enemy to die by his hand. Decisive, clean, leaving nothing. Environmentally friendly, he thought. No body to dispose of, no crime scene to clean up, no loose ends. Once the ash was carried off by the breeze into the sea and reefs, no one would ever find out. He forced the thought away. The fight wasn't over. Freya and the two masked men resumed combat, spells flaring and interlacing in the night, the air vibrating with magical impact. The masked men retreated a few paces, creating distance. Regulus closed in on Freya and watched the two opponents. They showed no emotion at their companion's death. From start to finish, they hadn't relaxed or exchanged a word. The companion's sudden disappearance seemed meaningless to them, like foam washed away by the sea. Nothing had changed. Still, Regulus felt them shifting toward retreat. As he approached, their movements became less aggressive and more about repositioning, covering each other as they angled toward the cliff edge. Whatever their purpose here had been, it was now impossible to achieve. Their ally had been eliminated instantly, and their opponent's strength exceeded expectations. Pressing the fight would only invite greater losses. Regulus didn't rush to strike. He leveled his wand at the lead masked man. A gray-green light gleamed at the tip, contained but ready to spark. The threat was effective. The masked man noticed immediately, and his footwork sharpened, changing direction constantly, leaving trailing afterimages in the night. He was dodging the wand's aim. He already knew what would happen if the spell locked on. Freya, feeling the pressure ease, held her wand high and whispered a tongue-twisting incantation. As the syllables fell, a bolt of lightning stabbed down from the sky, its silver-white light instantly illuminating the reef. It hit where one of the masked men had been standing moments before, shattering the reef and sending stone fragments flying. Between castings, she glanced sideways at Regulus. Her gaze on the battlefield was focused and sharp, but when it flicked to him, something passed across her face, a movement so brief it was almost a trick of light. Then she rolled her eyes. It lasted a fraction of a second and was gone. On a battlefield of life and death, this valiant, icy German witch, 188 centimeters tall, had rolled her eyes at him. Regulus wasn't entirely sure he hadn't imagined it, but it had definitely happened. He found it oddly entertaining. He wouldn't have used the word cute, but vivid seemed fitting. A powerful witch with a decisive style revealing such a small, human expression was an amusing contrast. Then his attention snagged on Freya's spellcasting. Her method was peculiar, distinctive. Her chanting was kept very low and astonishingly fast. The syllables blurred together so the individual pronunciations were lost. Her wand movements were minimal, a faint flick of the wrist, yet the lightning's force was enormous. The silver-white bolts had a faint blue halo at the edges and fell on slightly curved trajectories, as if guided by an invisible hand. They struck with pinpoint accuracy and didn't spread afterward. Each impact left a small, neat, charred pit. Efficient, precise, pragmatic. The rhythm of her casting, the shape of the magical eruption, even the texture of the light carried her personal signature. She cast with elegant composure, as if conducting a symphony instead of fighting. Regulus thought he'd read a description like this somewhere, but there was no time to reminisce. The two masked men began to coordinate. The leader slipped back while continuing to dodge Regulus's aim. The other took a position ahead of him and stopped attacking proactively, instead weaving defensive spells, shield charms, deflection curses, impedimenta, and a few he didn't recognize, forming a defensive curtain around them. A slimy, low chant began in the leader's throat, slow and viscous, words that did not sound human. The syllables had the texture of something from the deep sea, dull, oppressive, washing outward in wave after wave. Regulus felt the magical environment shift, but it wasn't only a change in magic. Something else spread, creeping like silent mist. It had no color, no form, no temperature, and yet it existed. It touched the reefs and they remained reefs. It touched the waves and they remained waves. It reached the edge of his perception, and a chill rose from the depths of his consciousness. He narrowed his eyes. This was the abyssal whisper's psychic miasma, the sort of thing Freya had warned him about. Oddly, Freya's rhythm didn't change. She kept casting, maintained the standoff, as if she hadn't noticed the spreading eerie influence at all, or as if she had and didn't care. She didn't try to interrupt the leader's chant. Regulus felt baffled. What was she planning? Why let the opponent complete that chant? Unless she wanted the enemy to cast so she could test something, or wanted him to experience the effect firsthand. Regulus stopped watching Freya and focused solely on the lead masked man. He had questions, but he wouldn't interfere. He wanted to see what the psychic miasma truly was, and what Freya was up to. But he could not afford to fail. He drew a steady breath. Arcane energy circulated through him as his mental wards snapped into place. Occlumency activated. He constructed a complex labyrinth on the periphery of his mind, layered, nested, constantly shifting, so that any intruding consciousness would have to navigate paths that rewired at every turn. Orion's 4.5 stars flared in his inner world, steady and bright, a solid anchor. Magic traced along those stellar paths. With each circuit, his mental defenses grew stronger. He wove the star imagery into the barrier. The solidity of the stars, the order of orbits, the sense of cosmic permanence, tempered through countless meditations, became part of his protection. The barrier stopped being a rigid shell and seemed to come alive, flowing, breathing, attuned to intent. He placed his most central self at the heart of that inner world, ringed by orbital wards, the occlumency labyrinth, and layer upon layer of defenses. He was ready. The masked man's spell was complete. Chapter 170. The Blue Flame That Blooms in Germany. The masked man tapped his twin forward with a light motion that nevertheless felt heavy, like forcing open an iron gate. The two masked figures fell back, fighting as they went, until they reached the cliff's lip. Without exchanging another word, they jumped in unison, vanishing into the darkness with the dull splash of heavy bodies hitting water. They had retreated, but the invisible assault they had unleashed still surged toward Regulus and Freya. It struck Regulus's mental barrier and spread instantly, like a tide breaking a dam or mist seeping into every crack. At first, it did not attack outright. It probed, crawling over the surface of his mind as if searching for flaws, for any seam it could exploit. Finding none, Regulus's barrier was complete. It changed tactics. Rather than smash, it infiltrated. It divided into countless filaments, finer than hairs, burrowing into the barrier from every angle. Each filament carried the same corrosive message. What is the point of fighting? What is the point of resisting? What is the point of living? The ideas rose like a tide meant to drown his will. Regulus felt his superficial consciousness being toyed with. The urge to fight, the hunger to prove himself, the conviction that victory mattered, each blurred and faded. The restraints Freya had warned him about pressed in. It made you forget why you were resisting. Still, his core self-awareness held. He sat at the center of his mental world, watching the erosion creep along the facade. The occlumency labyrinth he had built trapped the attack at the margins. He did not immediately seal it out. Instead, he deliberately opened a tiny breach, allowing a controlled portion of the assault into his deeper mind, without letting it touch the lowest, most fundamental layer of who he was. He wanted to see how it operated at depth. In those lower levels, the star orbit meditation ran denser. The light of Orion's 4.5 stars braided into a net that wrapped his most basic self-awareness. The filaments struck that starlight and were checked, but they adapted. They clung to the grooves of the star orbit track and tried to worm inward, constantly whispering their message. Give up, it's meaningless, nothing matters. Then a colder, more elemental sensation arrived, not mere suggestion, but a cognition like oceanic pressure, the absolute silence and weight of the deep sea. That environment conveyed its meaning plainly. The individual's existence is meaningless. The will of one person has no value. Struggle is futile. It tried to smother the starlight itself, to graft the deep-sea nihilism onto his core. The star orbit meditation resisted. Starlight and chill collided, destroying and consuming each other. At the same moment, Regulus noticed Rigel, the star in Orion associated with protection, was changing. Where it had been half bright and half dim, it was growing steadily brighter. Protection versus tampering with consciousness. Could Rigel be acting to guard the self? The thought stirred in him. If Rigel corresponded to protection, perhaps it was shielding his fundamental identity from being overwritten. He would not risk further exposure. Regulus snapped his barrier tight, severing the infiltrating filaments and trapping them in the perimeter. Then he poured the full force of the star orbit meditation inward. The light of the 4.5 stars flared. The Tosh 21 cycle accelerated. The chill retreated, crushed and dispelled stroke by stroke. He used the order of starlight to overwrite the void, replacing the notion of indifference with the recognition that existence had meaning. From the attack's arrival to its experience and annihilation, no more than 3 seconds elapsed. Back in the real world, a flicker of blue fire blossomed before Freya. It was small, barely covering the space in front of her, and it lasted less than half a second, like a shield igniting and then vanishing. Whatever it had intercepted, it had blocked or destroyed. Something in Regulus tightened. He raised one eyebrow, an almost imperceptible motion, but enough for Freya to notice. She quietly turned her head toward the cliff the masked men had dove from, lips pressed into a thin line. The violent clash that had filled the air moments before fell away. The waves resumed their monotonous assault on the rocks. Crash, hiss, retreat, each impact sending a faint tremor through the stone at their feet. Freya stood with her back to him, watching the distant sea, gradually drifting into a kind of vacancy. She refused to look at the boy, closing the gap between them. Her platinum braid hung down her back, a few strands whipped loose by the wind. Regulus walked up beside her, the questions in his mind multiplying. Was that blue flame deliberate? Had she planned to show him something? Or had she not expected him to recover so quickly from the mental erosion? She had warned him beforehand that the shield charm wouldn't stop this kind of attack and had told him to protect his mind first, an indication of intimate familiarity with what they had faced. Being familiar with it, yet allowing it to happen, could only mean she'd staged it on purpose. But if so, what about the blue flame? Germany. Blue flames. Those two words made the connection almost automatic. Haus von Eisenhardt. Yet Freya had been personally introduced to Regulus by his father. Orion Black had led the family for decades, met and managed countless alliances, maintained close ties with other major lines. The Blacks and the Eisenhardts had been friends for generations. Their positions in the European wizarding aristocracy were roughly equivalent and frequently intertwined. Orion would not make a careless mistake in identifying someone. Could an impostor stroll into 12 Grimmauld Place, claim to be von Eisenhardt, and be accepted by him? In the closed, meticulous world of pure-blood society, where portraits, letters, magical projections, and long family records settle identities, Orion could not be so easily fooled. Unless, Regulus considered, Freya's von Eisenhardt identity was true but incomplete. She might indeed be a member of House Eisenhardt and yet carry another lineage, another secret bloodline. Pure-blood houses had intermarried for centuries, bloodlines mixed and layered. It was not unusual for a person to bear the blood of several families simultaneously, to inherit traits, skills, or uncommon magical traits from a distant, singular marriage generation ago. The blue flame was too distinct to dismiss. Such anomalies could point to an unusual branch in her ancestry. He stood beside her without pressing. Whatever her motives, Freya had shown no malice. If she'd come to betray or trap him, she wouldn't have personally appeared at the Black ancestral home to escort him here. She wouldn't have cooperated in battle. She wouldn't have pre-warned him how to defend his mind. Letting the mental erosion through looked more like an experiment, a test to see how he would react, whether he could stop it, how much he could withstand, and how he would behave afterward. Chapter 171. Hungry me? If Freya had deliberately shown him that blue flame, it could mean she wanted him to find something or to steer his thinking in a certain direction. Maybe it was simply inconvenient for her to say it outright. Some things can't be spelled out, they can only be hinted at. Regulus looked out at the distant sea. Under the cover of night, the water was black, almost blending with the sky. Clouds lay thick, there was neither moon nor star. Far off, a faint, lighter gray line could be seen, whether horizon, another bank of cloud, or an optical trick he couldn't tell. Waves rolled in and crashed against the reef beneath their feet, booming dully. White foam stood out against the dark like countless hands waving and then dissolving. It felt vast and desolate, like the edge of the world. It was a strange feeling. They had just been fighting for their lives, and now they stood in silence, looking at the sea. The witch beside him, who had only moments before been dueling two elite dark wizards, was doing the same, motionless and quiet. Regulus turned and studied Freya's profile. Her face had settled back into that calm, unreadable mask. Her features were sharp as if carved by a knife, completely different from the woman who had rolled her eyes a moment earlier. That eye roll tugged at the corner of Regulus's mouth. During the height of the fight, she had glanced at him, confirmed he was unharmed, and then quickly rolled her eyes. It made him realize Freya wasn't entirely what she appeared. Behind that placid face, there was something else. A clumsy, slightly blunt side, not good with social niceties. They hadn't known one another long. They'd met at Grimmauld Place that morning, taken a portkey to Reef Town, walked the town together, settled in at noon, spent the afternoon apart, and at 8 she'd knocked on his door to ask him out on patrol. Then the battle. All told, only 3 or 4 hours. But in that short time, Regulus had begun to form a clear impression of her. He looked back to the sea and called softly, "Miss von Eisenhardt." Freya turned. "Your 13 is very powerful," Regulus said sincerely. I've never seen the lightning strike curse cast like that. She studied his face, her eyes measuring, as if deciding whether his words were a probe. Regulus met her gaze without artifice, showing nothing but honest admiration. Freya's expression eased a fraction. "Mr. Black," she said quietly, "it is you who surprises me." Her tone was serious. There was no polite froth in it. Regulus smiled a little. "Please, call me Regulus." Freya blinked, lashes trembling. She hadn't expected him to suggest it, nor that this British boy, almost 20 centimeters shorter than her, would take the initiative. She inclined her head slightly. "You can call me Freya." "Freya," he replied naturally, as if naming a longtime friend. A fleeting, almost imperceptible relaxation crossed Freya's face and vanished. She called back, "Regulus," then held his look, as if waiting for him to say more or to ask something she couldn't ask herself. She wanted to ask about that spell. The gray-green effect had been unusual and devastating. An elite dark wizard erased by a single unique curse, with not even a corpse left behind. Any witch would be curious. But Freya couldn't ask outright. It might touch on family secrets or personal privacy. To pry would be impolite and could raise suspicion. So she waited, waiting for him to speak or to change the subject. Regulus could have asked questions of his own. What was that blue flame? Who exactly was she? Why had she allowed the opponent to cast mental erosion? What was her purpose here? The questions circled his mind, but he chose not to ask, at least not now. Part of him enjoyed watching her try to perform, to hide herself. He found it interesting that the stern, heroic witch in battle would roll her eyes in private and act awkwardly around him. After what had happened moments ago, he was even more convinced something was being concealed. In his star orbit meditation system, Nai had always sat in a preparatory state, not fully lit. Even after his first mental resonance, it hadn't changed. Yet the mental erosion in the fight had made that sigil glow brighter and brighter. The coincidence was too precise. It felt arranged. If so, Freya's understanding of him ran deeper than he'd thought. She seemed to know his mental defenses, his weak points, and which attack could confirm what. He was certain he had never told anyone about this, nor demonstrated it. If the information came from some higher or prophetic perspective, he had no way to respond. For now, he could only endure and watch. Let things unfold. See what else Freya would show and where this mission would lead. For the moment, the situation was favorable. The opportunity for 9 to light had come. The disintegration curse had been proven in combat, and the results exceeded his expectations. Whatever her motives, he had suffered no losses. "Freya," Regulus said her name again, then asked softly, "Are you hungry?" For a moment she seemed blank, as if surprised by the question. Confusion, surprise, and a little bewilderment passed across her face before she nodded, hesitant. Reeftown wasn't large, but its facilities were solid. As an important Eisenhart stronghold on the North Sea, dozens of staff and their families lived there year-round. Where there are people, there are needs, and where there are needs, there is commerce. Along the stone-paved Main Street shops were scattered. A store for 13 materials and potion ingredients, a grocer, a shop selling broomstick parts and repair tools, and a small tavern that did food. Its sign showed an octopus clutching a wineglass with its tentacles, the words "Derkrek" written in German script. The tavern's heavy oak door creaked as they pushed it open. Inside, the space was modest, about a dozen wooden tables, half empty. A fire burned in the hearth, throwing back the seaside damp. Dark, gloomy oil paintings of North Sea scenes hung on the walls, echoing the night outside. The proprietor, a short, stout, middle-aged wizard with a small mustache and an apron stained by grease, nodded at Freya's entrance without fuss and barely glanced at Regulus. They took a table by the window. Regulus sat opposite her. "What have you got to eat?" "German food," Freya replied. Chapter 172. Come on, everyone. Freya beckoned, and the owner came over. She rattled off a few sentences in German faster than she spoke English, and Regulus only caught scattered words: Brot, bread, Wurst, sausage, Kartoffeln, potatoes, beer, beer. The owner nodded and went away. Soon a wooden tray arrived, piled high. There was a plate of sliced dark rye bread, its rich grain scent rising from the slices. 2 plates of sausages. One held small pan-fried Nuremberg sausages, golden brown and thin, 1 bite apiece. The other held thick, short Munich white sausages, kept in warm water to hold the temperature. A plate of potato salad came next, thin sliced potatoes mixed with onions and pickles, dressed in a milky, tangy sauce. 2 bowls of thick soup, studded with chunks of meat and vegetables, glistened with a sheen of oil on the surface. Freya ordered a glass of dark beer for herself. Since Regulus was underage, he had pumpkin juice. They began to eat. Regulus cut into a white sausage, peeled off the casing, dabbed a little sweet mustard on it, and tasted it. The meat was delicate, with a faint, spicy aroma, marjoram, parsley, cardamom, very different from the rough sausages back in Britain. He tried the potato salad too. It was pleasantly sour with a hint of sweetness. Freya ate very quietly. She cut off a small piece of sausage and brought it to her lips with remarkably slow, almost soundless motions. Her mouth closed, her jaw moved a fraction, and the contrast with the fierce, heroic image she'd shown in battle was sharp. Regulus matched her quietness. They traded only a few words now and then. "How long has this place been open?" he asked. 40 years, Freya answered, passed down from the owner's father. "Do you come here often?" "When on missions," she said. Brief answers, never more than necessary. Regulus didn't press. They ate, occasionally looking out the window, occasionally offering a trivial comment. After the meal, they left the tavern. Night had thickened. Dark clouds had opened in one small gap, and moonlight streamed through, laying a narrow silver path over the sea that stretched out into the distant black. The waves sounded softer, less violent than before. Freya walked ahead. Regulus followed at her side. They walked along the stone path toward the small cabin by the water. The moon stretched their shadows long, one tall, one short, one in front, one behind. At the cabin door, Freya stopped. Regulus stopped with her. She looked down at him. "Abyssal Whisper will be quiet for a few days," she said, her voice returning to its usual calm. "They won't give up. We keep patrolling tomorrow. I'll come get you in the morning." Regulus nodded. Freya blinked once, then her tone softened oddly, as if coaxing a child, though not very adeptly. "Don't worry. They don't know who you are. You have nothing to fear." Regulus looked up, a little stupefied. He was 12, not 2. Freya had already turned and walked away. Her platinum braids swung in an arc and settled on her shoulder. Her steps were a touch faster than usual. Regulus wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but there seemed to be something like cheerfulness in them. He watched her disappear around the corner and shook his head. Inside the cabin, he washed quickly and lay down. The ceiling was raw wood with a few repaired cracks. Outside the window, the waves rolled in and out like breathing. After spacing out for a while, his thoughts sharpened. Regulus analyzed himself. His mind seemed more active than usual, but that wasn't a serious problem. He had spent years maintaining a cool, rational composure, but that didn't mean he lacked feeling. Today he had met an adult witch who had left a deep impression. Heroic build, a cold, handsome face, efficient, and with tiny expressions that betrayed a softer or unfamiliar side. He found it intriguing. That curiosity had stirred his thoughts. He pushed the distractions aside and turned to business. The first strike hadn't worked. The opponent dodged, and the spell even cracked on impact. That proved the disintegration curse was not infallible. It needed to hit effectively. If it only nicked an arm or grazed a limb, an experienced wizard with quick reactions and ruthless methods could survive. The second strike was different. By combining Space Leap and Space Anchor, he teleported the curse directly onto the opponent's skin. The effect was immediate and total, no time to react. A direct hit, a direct kill. In a duel, not every spell lands. Enemies dodge, block, use countermeasures. If a spell is dodged, cast another. But when the disintegration curse connects properly, it could kill with a single blow. That was the lesson. And then he had killed someone for the first time. Regulus examined his consciousness and spirit carefully. There was no physical unease. Morally, there were no waves of guilt. Mentally, no shock. His soul felt untouched. Last year in Nocturne Alley, he'd discussed killing with Orion. Back then, he had said he had no particular stance, that he wasn't afraid of killing. That judgment, formed from a calm self-understanding at the time, seemed accurate now. The act hadn't unsettled him. He considered the mental erosion, the spell the masked man had used at the end, the chill in cognition. It hadn't attacked the body or his magic, but his will to fight, his sense of purpose. Regulus had put that erosion into his mental barrier and watched Rigel light up gradually. The quality of the erosion, however, was low. It couldn't breach his occlumency without Regulus opening a gap for it. In that situation, the only thing to do was verify and strengthen his defenses. Still, Rigel needed that confrontation. It needed to be tested and hardened. If he kept facing similar attacks or sought out higher-level confrontations, Rigel should become fully ignited. That was a gain. Freya came to mind again. Regulus was almost certain she had acted deliberately. This was not just an isolated incident. There would be follow-up. A face slid up from the depths of memory. Silver-white, ashy-gray, medium-length hair combed back. Eyes that seemed to perceive everything and yet cared for nothing. Elegant, dangerous, charming, violent. The image rose and hung there. He sat up suddenly and waved at the ceiling for no reason, as if greeting someone, then lay back down and shook his head at himself. Boring. It was all speculation, baseless. There was no proof the blue flame belonged to that person, no proof Freya had any connection to him, no proof this mission had been arranged by anyone else. There was another reason he hadn't asked Freya directly. If he did and his suspicions were true, asking would seal the answer. The open-ended story would snap into a fixed script with only a single path. He would be forced down it. But if he didn't ask, if he simply didn't know, then the process might play out differently. Both outcomes were acceptable. At least logic was on his side. He could act, pretend, and when needed say, "I don't know." Then he thought, even if that person was behind everything, would it change anything what he did? If someone had arranged all this for a purpose of their own, his cooperation or resistance might not affect the outcome. There was no point in getting lost in hypotheticals. Whoever stood behind it, whatever their motive, all he could do now was move forward, grow stronger, and keep accumulating advantages, step by step. One thing he did not doubt, he was worth the attention. Dumbledore had already entered the field, guiding him, coaching him, funneling resources through the professors. Lord Voldemort had entered too, using dark enlightenment to test and tempt him. If there was a third party, they would be doing the same in their own way. He turned over and closed his eyes. Sleep. For the next 10 days, Reef Town was calm and peaceful. The abyssal whisper did not appear again. During that time, Regulus enjoyed a rare stretch of quiet. He patrolled 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening, with Freya, walking the perimeter to check the protective runes and scan for abnormal magical fluctuations. The rest of the time, he arranged as he pleased, sometimes wandering the cobbled streets and visiting every shop. The apothecary that sold magical ingredients carried pearl powder and a North Sea seaweed extract unique to the area. The owner, a reticent elderly wizard, would only nod when he saw Regulus and return to fussing over his wares. The landlady at the grocery was more talkative. In heavily accented English, she asked where he was from, how old he was, and how long he planned to stay. Regulus answered politely that he was 18. The landlady peered at his face, shook her head, and muttered something in German he could not catch. Most of the time, he stayed in his small cabin. There was still much to practice. He kept refining the disintegration curse, working to make the transition between its 2 forms smooth and reliable. The coordination between Space Leap and Space Anchor still needed adjustment, and he was experimenting with integrating his mind-splitting technique into the sequence. He had Fiendfire under control at the size of 3 small birds, but its splitting speed and precision could be improved. He also kept the notebook Professor McGonagall had given him by his bedside, flipping through a few pages before sleep. As the dynamic geometric figures traced and morphed across the paper, he was already drawing fresh insights from them. Those 10 days were simple: patrol, sail, practice, and read. He spent more time with Freya, and occasionally they went to the small tavern for supper together. Anyone who spent enough time with Regulus, so long as they did not fixate on his appearance, would never treat him like a child. His manner, temperament, way of speaking, and outlook were all unmistakable. After a while, people simply overlooked his age. Freya's impression of him was changing too. One evening after patrol, they stood on the cliff, watching the sunset. Freya said suddenly, "You remind me of someone." Regulus turned to look at her, but she didn't continue, her gaze fixed on the distant sea. From Freya's perspective, this boy was extraordinary. In conversation, she found his understanding of magic exceeded that of most wizards she knew. Not all, but enough that she couldn't help comparing him silently to someone else she had known. The comparison itself spoke volumes. Once they discussed the nature of magic, Regulus said casually, "Magic is a tool and it is a language, but ultimately it's a relationship. The relationship between the caster and the world, between magic and matter, between individual will and collective will." Freya was quiet for a long time after that. She remembered hearing similar things from another person years earlier, when she had been an adult in a low-ranking position and had to listen as he expounded on lofty magical concepts. Back then, she could only receive and digest. The boy before her, whom she suspected to be only 12 despite his claims, needed no teaching. He grasped and could articulate such ideas on his own. Another time, they talked about changes in the wizarding world. Regulus said, "What's happening in Britain is a long overdue reshuffling. Voldemort's ideology isn't new. People proposed it centuries ago. What he did differently was turn the idea into a movement, and the movement into a war. War changes many things," he added. "Old rules break, and new rules are built on the ruins. Families that cling to tradition and can't adapt will be eliminated. Those who can adapt, or who create new rules, will survive." He made no explicit target of the remark. It could describe the new order after Voldemort's victory, or the reshuffling of old powers after his defeat. It could point to the longer-term influence of the Muggle world on witches and wizards, or to changes not yet visible. He was stating a pattern, not passing judgment. Freya asked, "Which kind does the House of Black belong to?" Regulus smiled. "We will survive, and we will thrive." She nodded and did not press further. Regulus said many things like that, about how Muggle technological development might affect the wizarding world, about variations in pureblood ideology across countries, and about the eventual direction of the confrontation between Dumbledore and Voldemort. His insights were calmly observational, deduced logically from a high vantage. Freya listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes frowning, sometimes looking at him as if to ask silently, "How do you know all this?" Regulus would smile at that look. The conversations were easy and comfortable. He could talk to Orion, but their discussions usually stayed centered on that small patch of Britain, the affairs of the House of Black, Voldemort's movements, Dumbledore's maneuvers, the Ministry. Orion didn't need or want to explore beyond that. It felt too remote to affect their house. With Freya, there was no purpose beyond exchange, no scheming, no need to perform. Just saying what was on his mind felt like release. Freya responded in turn, describing how wizards in Germany viewed certain matters, what the elders of the House of Eisenhart thought, and records she had read. She spoke earnestly, trying to find the right English words. When she couldn't, she would slip into German and then correct herself, which Regulus found endearing. Once they discussed Lord Voldemort. Whenever the situation in Europe came up, two names could not be avoided: Dumbledore and Voldemort. Although both operated mainly in Britain, their influence extended well beyond its shores. Regulus mentioned Dumbledore first. Freya's expression changed. There was something unsaid in it, not rejection, but the sense of having a lot to say and choosing not to. She listened, nodded occasionally, and did not join him. When they reached Voldemort, she finally spoke. "He is indeed an extremely powerful dark wizard," she said. "In Britain, his influence is at its zenith. Most pure-blood families have already sided with him, and fanaticism is spreading." She watched Regulus for a reaction. He showed none. His face was blank, the usual neutral look, perhaps a touch indifferent. Fanaticism? No. Fear? Loyalty? Even less. To him, Voldemort was simply a powerful opponent, a threat to be dealt with, a force to be used if possible. If he ever needed to perform for others, he could adopt a persona, projecting awe and deference to power, the kind of pure-blood supremacy Vamp Voldemort might expect. But even a designed persona would not be servile. After all, he controlled his own body. Freya breathed a quiet sigh of relief and offered her own assessment. "His power is strong, there's no doubt, but he's middling." Her tone was flat, almost bored. "He's been operating in the British Isles for so long and still hasn't secured a decisive advantage compared to—" She stopped. Regulus finished the thought for her. "Compared to someone with a broader vision?" Freya's eyes brightened for a moment and then dimmed, She neither confirmed nor denied it. No one questioned Voldemort's ability to wreak havoc in Britain. But among German purebloods who remembered the Grindelwald years, a dark wizard who could go on for years and still not topple the British ministry looked, frankly, somewhat limited. That noon, after patrol, they returned to the cliff. The weather was splendid. Bright sun, calm sea, a horizon curved like the edge of the world. "This view is beautiful," Regulus said, gazing out with obvious appreciation. Freya glanced around, raised a hand, and gestured. Ripples shimmered in the air, and as if summoned, a house elf materialized. Freya spoke quickly in German. The elf bowed and vanished with a pop. Regulus raised an eyebrow and said nothing more, waiting. A few minutes later, the house elf reappeared, carrying a picnic blanket and several food containers. When they were opened, they revealed roasted sausages, rye bread, potato salad, pickles, a few wedges of cheese, a bottle of pumpkin juice, and a glass of dark beer. The two sat on the rocks facing the sea and began to eat. The sea breeze ruffled their hair, the sun warmed them, and for a while everything felt comfortably ordinary. Chapter 174, From Prophecy. Does Durmstrang really teach the dark arts? Regulus asked casually. Freya glanced at him, a faint twitch to her lips. They do, but not everything, and not the way the rumors make it sound. We study the theory, the principles, how to recognize them, and how to defend against them. The principle says you must understand them if you are to break them and prevent harm. She took a sip of dark beer. Of course, some people go on to research darker things on their own afterward. That's their choice. The school doesn't interfere. Regulus nodded. Hogwarts doesn't teach it openly either, but the professors keep an eye out. If they find a student with talent and the right temperament, they'll offer private guidance. The truly dangerous stuff is still off limits. Freya considered that for a moment. Two different philosophies. Yes, he agreed. They ate in companionable silence for a while. Regulus put down his bread and stared toward the distant sea. The situation in Britain keeps getting worse. Confrontation, fanaticism, war feels inevitable. The pureblood families are already split. Some side with Voldemort, some with Dumbledore, and a few try to stay neutral. But neutrality won't last. Sooner or later, everyone will have to choose. And Germany? Regulus asked. Do our pureblood families lean one way or the other? Freya thought slowly. It's hard to say. Most are waiting to see. The last war changed a lot. People learned the cost of taking sides blindly. Besides, German pureblood attitudes are different from the British. He understood. The last war had been Grindelwald's revolution. Germany had been its center. Both Muggle and wizarding eyes were on it. Many pureblood houses had been tested. Whether they supported Grindelwald or not, they had been forced to confront ideology directly. Grindelwald's credo of "for the greater good" aimed at a new order where wizards might rule Muggles, and he recognized talent regardless of blood status. Compared to Voldemort's narrower pureblood supremacy, Grindelwald's vision had been broader. He failed, but his ideas left a residual influence. Britain, by contrast, had Dumbledore, a bulwark that shaped most British wizards' perception of Grindelwald as simply a dark wizard Dumbledore had defeated without much examination of his aims. That produced a divergence. British wizards tended to be conservative, clinging to tradition and centering around the ministry. German wizards were more pragmatic, valuing practical results and willing to understand everything, even the dark arts. Freya spoke calmly. Regulus nodded from time to time. When she softened to reminisce, her usually cold expression became almost gentle. Her eyes blurred as if recalling something distant. The conversation returned to Voldemort. "What do you think of him?" she asked casually, but her eyes held him, waiting. Regulus paused. A powerful dark wizard with a clear goal, a clear path, and the will to follow it. His philosophy is simple and direct. Pure blood rule. Half-bloods and Muggleborns either submit or disappear. "Do you agree with it?" she asked. "No," he answered without hesitation. Freya's question was more than casual curiosity. For an heir of a pureblood family publicly aligned with Voldemort to ask a fellow heir point-blank whether he agreed, there was a test in that question, a quiet probing. Regulus answered truthfully but deliberately. It was both his belief and an answer meant to be heard. She didn't push. Instead, she nodded and looked at him. "I thought you'd be different." He smiled but said nothing. The smile itself conveyed the truth. Freya's eyes flashed. This was exactly what she had wanted to learn. To her, Regulus existed in three versions: the Regulus described by that person, the Regulus described by others, and the Regulus in front of her. After 10 days together, she was increasingly sure the boy before her was not the cold, ruthless Slytherin heir others spoke of. How did others describe him? As a rising star favored by Voldemort, someone who enforced order in Slytherin, calm, decisive, and ruthless, the archetypal pure-blood heir. But the Regulus she saw was more. He appreciated her knowledge, listened seriously, and laughed at things he found amusing. When he mentioned Voldemort, there was no special reverence. He spoke as if referring to any dark wizard. He did not accept Voldemort's philosophy. Those traits did not match the standard descriptions. They matched the depiction that person had given, though that portrayal was more abstract, more distant, like a concept. The Regulus in front of her had warmth. He would stand on a cliff and marvel at the view, or smile while watching her fumble with English before suddenly switching to German. If she had to compare, the living Regulus was the more appealing. She exhaled softly. Most German pure-blood families view Voldemort much like you do, acknowledge his power and dominance among the British purebloods, but she left the sentence hanging. Regulus understood. Compared to Grindelwald, Voldemort's scope was narrower. After they finished eating, they packed up and walked back. The sun slanted west and painted a golden path across the sea. Just as they reached the little cabin's door, Freya stopped. Regulus stopped with her. She turned to him, serious. "Regulus, there's something I want to ask." He met her gaze. "If one day you found there was a kind of knowledge ahead, a knowledge that made everything you've learned feel childish, clumsy, or even superficial, would you choose to look at it?" she finished. He didn't answer at once. Her eyes held only a pure question, nothing else. The question seemed sudden, but not really. The 10 days they'd spent together, those faint clues, that hint, and the person she had mentioned but refused to speak of, all of it led to this moment. He was silent for a long time. "I would look," he said finally. "All knowledge describes some facet of this world. If my learning looks childish in the face of something deeper, it doesn't mean I was wrong, only incomplete." He paused, then added, "And then I'd decide how far that knowledge could go with me." Freya listened and stared at him for a long time afterward. Whether illusion or not, Regulus saw something like speechlessness in her eyes. She only nodded and said nothing more. Back in the cabin, Regulus sat on the edge of the bed. Outside the window, twilight deepened and the waves kept their slow, hollow rhythm. He turned Freya's question over in his mind. It wasn't the content of the question that occupied him so much as the fact that she had asked it at all. Freya had almost laid her cards on the table, short of whispering, "Yes, everything is arranged." First, she had let him experience the Abyssal Whisper's mental erosion himself so he could verify that the rune could be lit. Then came the 10 days of observation, time spent with him, listening to his views, testing whether he accepted Voldemort's creed. It had felt like confirmation, like waiting. And now she had thrown down another temptation. "There is something more powerful," she seemed to say, "something that will make everything you know feel elementary." According to her, it truly existed. Regulus lay back and stared at the ceiling. He had no absolute proof that everything had been orchestrated, but it was all too coincidental. Each event matched his needs at the moment. The rune required a protective will, the need to test the persistence of one's will under mental erosion, and the Abyssal Whisper had arrived at his doorstep. Lighting the rune would be difficult alone. How long would it take to accomplish? Now, someone was telling him there was something even more potent waiting, and Freya claimed it existed. If everything was as he suspected, that someone was arranging all of this, then that person's perspective was astonishingly high. Selecting the moment, choosing the target, positioning the key elements, and letting them unfold naturally, all of it felt almost benevolent rather than manipulative. At least Regulus felt no resentment. Whoever was behind this knew what he needed, knew when he needed it, and even knew he would not resist being guided. The figure in his mind grew clearer. Chapter 175. Grindelwald. I'm watching you. Regulus knew there was no such thing as a free lunch in this world, especially not from someone like that, and especially when he was the target. If his guess was right, What did the other side want? The requirements for igniting Regulus were brutal. It demanded a protective will, the determination to stand one's ground for something, someone, or some belief, even if the cost outweighed the gain. You had to stand there and not retreat. Regulus was rational to the bone. He had a sensitive side, but that sensitivity was reserved for specific things. When those things were at stake, he trusted his instincts and let his feelings flow. In other matters, he moved by reason. For someone like him to ignite Regulus would be particularly difficult. Still, he didn't doubt his capacity to do it. What had worried him before was the possibility that he simply couldn't. Star orbit meditation was the foundation of his entire magical system. If Regulus stayed unlit, if the Orion model stalled at 4.5 stars and could not be perfected, his future growth would be affected. Perhaps that was what the other person saw. They saw him poised at a fork in the road, unable to break through because he lacked something, and so they intervened. Or perhaps he could ignite Regulus on his own, but in the wrong way. Perhaps in the future he would do it to protect someone or something, and the consequences of that choice would be unacceptable to whoever was watching. So they intervened, letting him light it earlier, and on terms they preferred. Regulus smiled at the thought. Either way, he wasn't going to give up. Star orbit meditation was his foundation. He would follow it to the end. At worst, he would find another road. If Orion failed, he could turn to other constellations: Aquila, Cygnus, Draco, Libra. The starry sky was vast. There would always be a pattern that matched him. He stretched, took a long breath, and slowly exhaled. He could leave right now. He could go home and tell Orion everything, explain the last 10 days and voice his suspicions. Even if they were baseless, his father would understand his approach. But if it really was Grindelwald, if that man had arranged this stage for him, Regulus wanted to step on it. He wanted to see what he himself looked like through the eyes of someone who could see the future. The urge was strong. It wasn't just the chance to light Regulus, though that alone could elevate his entire magic system. Space magic would stabilize, fiendfire control would improve, his use of natural magic would deepen, and both his will and his body would strengthen in tandem. He wanted, more than anything, a long-distance exchange with that person. He wanted to taste, even in a hint, the power of time. Wasn't predicting the future just another form of time? What could be more miraculous than weaving past and future together, turning choices into inevitabilities, making something that hasn't happened yet appear as scenery in someone else's eyes? Regulus cleared his head and thought back to Freya's question. What could make everything he was learning now seem childish, clumsy, or superficial? He had answered lightly then. He could still see the unreadable look on her face and the brief flash of blue flame that had vanished. Freya probably thought a 12-year-old trying to sound wise was just putting on airs, but those had been his honest thoughts. He didn't have many truly systematic achievements. In natural magic, he had already built a path from observation to replication to creation. He extracted and understood the mandrake's decomposition property and transformed it into the disintegration curse. That path was open. He only needed to repeat the method to acquire the properties of more magical plants. In space magic, he had started from the house elf folding principle to develop the space leap spell and then combined it with the family's space anchor to produce teleportation by spell. There were still countless directions to dig. How far could space folding go? Could he fold larger spaces? Could he fold everything inside a space? Star orbit meditation, the method he had created, used stellar trajectories to temper his spirit, body, and magical power so all three could grow in sync. The 4.5 stars were stable, and if his guess was right, Regulus was about to be lit. These 3 branches might seem few, but each could be expanded almost infinitely. The endpoint of natural magic would be understanding and replicating the magical properties of every magical plant. The endpoint of space magic would be controlling space itself. The endpoint of star orbit meditation would be laying the whole sky out inside his mind. He firmly believed he was on the right path. He could see where it led. Each step felt solid, and every result could be verified. These things were practical, effective in combat, and would help him survive. He was not arrogant enough to claim his path was the most powerful. Magic was never a race to the finish. There were older inheritances, magical systems he had never seen and could not imagine. Before school, Orion had told him there were worlds beyond the world. The British wizarding world was only a corner of Europe, Europe a corner of Earth, and Earth merely a speck in the universe. He had witnessed Dumbledore's power, a light strong enough to dispel a curse accumulated over hundreds of years. He had studied Voldemort's dark enlightenment, a dense body of dark knowledge that represented a wholly different path. He had endured the mental erosion of the abyssal whisper. That sort of magic, which attacked the will to fight itself, was unlike any dark arts he had seen. He would not reject any of it. If there was some magic that made his current studies look childish or superficial, he would not deny his own shortcomings. Dumbledore himself had admitted that no one had walked further down the path of the dark arts than Voldemort. Regulus didn't want to possess everything. That was impossible. He merely walked his own road. Still, he was curious. What kind of magic could make him feel so small? Lying on his bed and staring at the ceiling, a new perspective occurred to him. Maybe his way of thinking was wrong. Rigel required the protection of the self. If that was the logic, then the thing that could help him ignite Rigel might not be a particular spell. It might be something that affected his self-perception, something that, through impact, clarified what he wanted to protect and how to protect it. What would that be? He guessed it might be a magical system, something completely contrary to the current mainstream. He set the thought aside. He couldn't pin it down now, but he would see soon enough. He thought of that person again, Grindelwald. Prophecy, or foresight, was a ruthless ability. Ordinary people lived inside time, moving forward second by second, anchored in today. They don't know tomorrow. Grindelwald was different. Standing in today, he could see tomorrow, the day after, and further still. That made him a dimension higher than ordinary wizards. It was like ants living on a flat plane who can only go forward, back, left, and right, unaware of people above them. Humans see the ants, remove the food in front of them, and change the ants' whole world. To the ants, such actions are incomprehensible. Add time, and you get a four-dimensional perspective. A life looks like a line. Maybe you cannot see the starting point, but the end would be visible. Choices are merely walking along that line. No accidents, no surprises, everything destined. If such a perspective existed, then in Grindelwald's eyes, Regulus might be merely a segment on a line. When he was born, what he encountered, and which choices he made, all already written. Yet Grindelwald still lost to Dumbledore. That proved foresight could be broken, for reasons that might be an emotional blind spot in Dumbledore, his guilt over Ariana, the Elder Wand's rules, or an over-reliance on foresight itself. Whatever the cause, Regulus had no means to resist a figure like Grindelwald, at least not now, so he could only accept the arrangement. Even if he did not resent it, and even if it truly helped him, being arranged was still being arranged. It was the same essence as Voldemort offering his dark enlightenment. Voldemort used poison, threats, and irresistible force. Grindelwald was subtler, building a stage and inviting him to choose. The core was the same. The sound of waves drifted in from outside as Regulus rolled onto his side. He remembered the first day he met Freya, the unreadable look in her eyes, and the instant the blue flame flared and vanished. He remembered her serious question and the way she fell silent after hearing his answer. None of it felt like coincidence. But he did not resent it. He was almost eager. He wanted to know what the man who could see the future had seen in him. Regulus rose, opened the window, and let the sea breeze rush in. He closed his eyes and sank his consciousness inward. Star orbit meditation activated. Orion's 4.5 stars lit up in his mind. Their cold, steady light swept through every corner. His slightly churning heart calmed, and the fluctuations in his magical power quieted. Wait and see. Chapter 176. Regulus relaxed. The next 2 days passed without incident. The weather was fine, and the sunlight made the sea glitter. After asking that question, Freya seemed to have forgotten about it and never mentioned it again. Regulus did not bring it up either. He treated the matter like an unresolved scene in a play, waiting to see how it would unfold. For him, that waiting was new. Since birth, he had always known what came next. Voldemort's rise, war, the family's fracture, and the path he would be forced to take. He had believed that if he were given time, even if he could not become the absolute top, he could at least keep within sight of those ahead. By then, he might win enough freedom to pursue what he truly wanted. But that freedom hadn't arrived. In the short term, it seemed further away than ever. So he craved power. Every scrap of strength was one more guarantee for the future. While other young wizards his age fretted over homework, got excited about Quidditch, or lay awake thinking about a glance from someone they liked, Regulus always had something behind him chasing. Sometimes an image, Lord Voldemort, but more often a feeling. If he did not move faster, he would miss something. If he did not grow stronger, he would be swallowed. He didn't dare relax, and he had never really been able to. Voldemort's gaze, the Death Eater's scrutiny, the pressure to secure his family's survival, and the final choice that would one day come. These things had weighed on him for as long as he could remember, like a distant mountain that was always visible when he lifted his eyes. Standing here in Reef Town on Germany's North Sea, that mountain was still there, but it felt a little farther away. There were no eyes or ears for Voldemort here, no competing alliances of pureblood houses, and no factional infighting within Slytherin. There was only the sea, the wind, 3 daily patrols, and a taciturn German witch who was easy to be with. Regulus found himself relaxing, mentally. Smiles came more often. During patrols, he would sometimes make Freya laugh with a joke, and at meals, he would point out which dish was worth trying. Occasionally, he would fly out over the water on his broom and, returning, tell her what he'd seen: a pod of dolphins, a giant sea turtle, a rainbow rising over the distant waves. Freya always listened with a slight, unreadable expression, but Regulus could tell she was paying attention. Relaxation did not mean negligence. He still practiced magic every day. Part of the reason he could afford to feel relaxed in Germany was that his power was adequate. If it had not been, he would have been like Sirius, kept within the family estate day after day, drilling basic spells. If he had been weak or unremarkable, Orion wouldn't have given him the freedom to manage his own time, to train in the arts he preferred, or to grant him such autonomy. The House of Black needed a capable heir. With Sirius being what he was, Regulus had to step up. He wasn't at the top yet, but he was doing well enough. He knew, though, that this was only a holiday interlude. He would eventually return to Britain, to the place where he had to be sharp at all times. That place was the foundation of the House of Black. Status, power, wealth, learning, industry, things their ancestors had defended for 1,000 years. They needed someone to guard and inherit them, someone to ensure they continued to exist and flourish in the new age. For now, he enjoyed it. He could feel his magic shifting, lighter, brighter, more eager, as if something inside him were waking. His Patronus seemed to answer the summons. It wanted to appear, to soar. Standing on a cliff edge, Regulus followed that impulse. With a small thought, silver-white light burst from his chest and condensed into the familiar shape. The starry sky kite spread its wings and tilted back to let out a clear, bright cry, cheerful as a rallying call. Regulus smiled and raised his hand. He cast the flying charm and rose from the ground, drifting forward and upward. The sea breeze pushed into his collar with a cool touch while the sun warmed him. The starry sky kite circled above, scattering ribbons of silver light with each flap. It would vanish from one spot and reappear dozens of meters away above the water a second later, then materialize back on Regulus's shoulder. On an impulse, Regulus formed a second creature. From his fingertips, an orange-red bird of living flame took shape, flapped its wings, and perched on his other shoulder, a fiendfire bird. There they were, 2 birds, silver-white and orange-red, on his left and right. The starry sky kite cocked its head, curious about the sudden companion, and tentatively tapped the fiendfire bird with a wing. The fiendfire bird remained still, only turning its head to look, held in place by Regulus's will. The kite tapped again with a broader surface. When the silver radiance and orange flame met, they hissed softly. The starry sky kite acted as if it had been burned, snapping its wing back and nearly tumbling off his shoulder. It shook and splashed silver light everywhere, then cautiously approached again on its own terms, content this time to watch from a distance. Regulus watched, smiling wider. The starry sky kite represented the freer part of him, curious, adventurous. The Fiendfire bird was an extension of his command, raw and dangerous, but under his control. Having both appear and interact like living creatures revealed that his mastery of magic had moved beyond mere technique. He was mastering coexistence with his powers. The kite tried a few more tentative gestures before giving up and flying off to circle him. From a nearby window, Freya watched. From that distance, Regulus was a small figure, but the silver light and the orange flare on his shoulders stood out. She watched the boy flying over the sea, the way the two lights intertwined, and the real smile on his face. Usually stern even when alone, she felt something in her soften. Beyond martial skill, there was now something gentler in her demeanor. Her smile faded quickly, though. She thought of arrangements she had been given, of the kind of magic that made everything she herself had learned feel simple, and she thought of the question she had once asked him. Worry rose in her chest. Before she had thought it didn't matter. He was someone she'd heard about but didn't really know. If he had a special destiny, let it be. She was only here to complete a mission. But after 10 days together, they had become people who could exchange spells, discuss the situation, and share quiet meals. Despite the 13 or 14-year age gap and the fact that she towered over him, she found herself unconsciously overlooking his youth when they talked or spent time together. She did not want anything to happen to him. Freya watched the boy a while longer. A Patronus and Fiendfire appearing together, and even interacting, was extraordinary. A talented wizard could summon a Patronus. That was normal. A powerful wizard might control Fiendfire. That was rare, but not unheard of. To produce both at once and keep them peaceful enough to behave like living beings showed an understanding of magic beyond simple usage. He was coexisting with his power. Freya decided to trust him a little more. After the evening patrol, they went back to the small tavern. At their usual window table sat 2 glasses of pumpkin juice, a plate of sausages, and potato salad. Freya set down her fork and looked at Regulus. Something's happened in the family. Regulus put his fork down as well and met her gaze. An important member has been injured, Freya said evenly. The patriarch has ordered retaliation. She drew her wand and gave it a light wave above the table. Silver light issued from the tip and wove into a 3-dimensional map in the air. The coastline, Reef Town's position, the sea stretching north, the silhouettes of several small islands, and a single spot marked deep red. She pointed at the red dot. This is an important stronghold of the Abyssal Whisper, about 120 nautical miles from Reef Town. Regulus studied the map and did a quick mental calculation. Are we going? He asked. We are, Freya replied. Tomorrow. She watched him for a reaction. Regulus only nodded. Okay. A look of eager anticipation crossed his face. He wanted to test himself in a fight at sea. Freya, seeing how readily he agreed, was not surprised. When they first met, she doubted what a 12-year-old could do. People spoke of destinies and futures, but those were distant matters. He was a child. What could he accomplish? Now, after these days, she had already started to change her mind. Chapter 177. You show off. I show off too. When Freya saw with her own eyes Regulus handle the masked man, all her doubts vanished. She had been watching him constantly. After all, he was someone she had brought from Britain, and she had accepted responsibility for him. She could not let anything happen to him on his first day here. She had seen the gray-green spell vanish for a split second before hitting the target, only for that short distance, and reappear directly on the other man's chest. The spell's effect was astonishing, but what was more remarkable was how it had been cast, a fusion of space magic and offensive arcane energy. A wizard capable of that, regardless of age, warranted attention. Freya met Regulus's eyes and found them shining with an expectant light. She nodded but said nothing, retracted her wand, and the map faded. They finished the rest of their meal in silence, then stood and walked back. Moonlight whitened the stone path. When they reached the door of the seaside cabin, Regulus stopped. "Good night, Freya," he said. "Good night, Regulus," she replied. Freya watched him open the door and go inside, then turned and left. Regulus closed the door and leaned against it for a while. After so much foreshadowing, was it finally coming? He didn't know the true relationship between the Abyssal Whisper and the House of Eisenhart, whether it was a real confrontation or only a facade. He didn't know what role the Abyssal Whisper had played in the incident, an orchestrator, a pawn, or a bystander swept in by circumstance. It didn't matter. He looked forward to tomorrow. What lay inside that stronghold? What magic would those people use? What could he gain? Would the fifth star finally light up in the coming confrontation, or was there another stage yet? The questions coalesced into a single thought. He would find out tomorrow. The next day was clear. The sea lay calm and flat, and sunlight gilded everything. Since he was going to the Abyssal Whisper stronghold, and there might be a battle, Regulus bought a new outfit in Reef Town. The town was small, with only a few shops selling magical supplies. Freya accompanied him as they checked the stores and finally found suitable gear in a shop that specialized in protective equipment. He put on a black, form-fitting base layer made from the hide of some marine creature, soft but tough, resistant to cuts and blunt force. Over it, he wore a short dark gray jacket of specially treated dragon hide, waterproof, windproof, and light. Matching tapered trousers and high-top boots followed, the soles carved with anti-slip runes so he could stand on wet reefs without slipping. Regulus studied himself in the mirror. The jacket outlined his shoulders and back. Though still slender, he had the shape of a young man now. Freya had changed as well. She wore almost the same outfit. Black base, dark gray dragonhide jacket, matching trousers and high boots, but cut to a feminine silhouette with a defined waist that made her look taller. Her platinum braid hung behind her. She looked sharp and valiant. Regulus glanced at her, then down at himself. They looked oddly like a matched set. They left the shop and headed for the town exit. The sun shone, and residents milled about. The landlady of a grocery store was sunning at her doorway. When they passed, her gaze lingered. There was appreciation, curiosity, and maybe a touch of disdain. A few young employees nearby slowed when they saw Freya, but when they noticed Regulus beside her, their expressions shifted to, "Who is this?" more disdainful than before. Regulus ignored it. Reef Town's population skewed older, young wizards were rare, and the two of them naturally drew attention. They walked out of town and followed the cliff path. A forest of reefs rose below, and the roar of waves grew louder. Regulus had assumed they would fly out on brooms. At 120 nautical miles, it would be just over an hour, or apparat to the vicinity and fly a stretch. Instead, Freya led him down to a natural harbor nestled among small reefs. The water was clear. He could see sea urchins grazing on starfish on the seabed. Freya produced a glass bottle from her pocket. It was palm-sized, its surface packed with runes that glowed faintly blue in the sunlight. Inside, a tiny, exquisitely crafted boat complete with masts, sails, and deck details. Regulus felt a strong sense of déjà vu. Freya set the bottle on a flat rock and tapped it with her wand. The bottle shimmered, crumbled like sand, and the fragments were carried off by the breeze. The miniature boat hovered where the bottle had been, keeping its scaled-down shape. With a flick of her wand, it launched in an arc and landed on the water dozens of meters away. The moment it touched the sea, the hull began to expand, fast, 10 meters, 20, 30, until it reached the size of a real warship. Dark timber gleamed oily in the sun. The bow rose slightly, carved with the image of a marine beast that might be a sea serpent or a dragon, coiled and bearing fangs. 3 masts stood tall. The sails unfurled themselves, each bearing the embroidered crest of House Eisenhart on white canvas. The ship rode steady on the waves. Regulus was about to ask how they would get on board, since the boat had been launched so far from the shore, when Freya looked at him with a flash of mockery, and then vanished. Apparition. In the next instant, she materialized on the ship's deck, standing at the rail and facing the shore. Regulus stood on the reef, speechless. Reef Town had an anti-apparition charm. He'd sensed it before, and Freya had mentioned it. The charm covered the entire town and a good portion of the adjacent coastal waters. That Freya could apparate into that area meant she had some clearance or identity recognition. Not as extreme as a headmaster's, but similar. What did the look she had given him mean? Showing off? He decided to try something in return. He closed his eyes and extended his spatial perception. The spatial structure around him unfolded in his mind. Reef, seawater, air, and that invisible wall, the anti-apparition barrier. The wall wasn't perfectly sealed. When Freya had apparated, She had torn the space and left a trace. Space could self-heal, but only a few seconds had passed, and the tear was still detectable. Regulus locked onto that trace, its location, direction, and extent. A skilled apparitionist could track someone who had just apparated by following such traces. That was what Moody had done back in Hogsmeade. But with the anti-apparition charm blocking the way, Regulus had to do more. He drew a deep breath and let magical energy surge. He cast a space leap, not to transport himself, since he wasn't able to do that yet, but to leap a path. At the spot of the torn spatial trace, he probed along the crack and opened a larger hole. The anti-apparition charm reacted immediately, the invisible wall attempting to close the breach. Regulus tapped his wand repeatedly, driving 5 space anchors into the tier at once. The anchors took hold and propped the opening, preventing it from sealing. The path to the ship was clear. He initiated apparition. His body compressed into the narrow crack, squeezed, and then burst free on the other side. His feet found solid wood. He was standing beside Freya. The deck swayed, the sails snapped with the breeze. Freya turned and looked at him. Her mouth opened slightly, and she blinked twice, less surprise than disbelief. She glanced back toward Reef Town, raised her wand, and intoned a quick, low counterspell. A faint light flared at the tip of her wand, and then died. The anti-apparition charm was still active. She turned back and stared at Regulus with a real question in her eyes. "How did you get here?" Regulus let her look. He held up the same expression she had given him on the reef a moment before, a little mockery, a little smugness. Freya's face stiffened, then she looked away in silence. Her brows tightened and relaxed. She pressed her lips together, forcing her face back to a severe, controlled mask, and deliberately avoided meeting his eyes again. Regulus laughed softly. Freya's ears twitched at the sound, but she stubbornly refused to turn back. Chapter 178. Grindelwald really knows how to arrange things. The boat slid forward at an unnerving speed, far faster than an ordinary sailing ship. Its hull was driven by an arcane engine, cleaving through the waves and leaving a white wake that stretched straight to the north. The two of them stood at the bow. The sea breeze was stronger than on land, whipping their clothes and rattling the rail. Sunlight glinted across the surface in a scatter of gold, shifting with the swell. Around them, an endless expanse of blue stretched to the horizon, the sky blue, the sea blue, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant seabird. The boat rode with a surprising steadiness, almost as if gliding on ice. Regulus rested his hand on the rail and stared ahead. Freya stood at his side, silent. She didn't cling to him, but she didn't leave him either. He felt her glance on him from time to time, as if weighing something, and pretended not to notice. They had left at dawn. Now the sun had climbed high, and he figured they had already covered more than half the distance. The sea darkened from pale blue to navy and then to near ink. Occasionally a fish and vanished in a silver flash. They were far from any regular shipping lanes, no islands, no other ships, only the vast open water. The visibility was excellent. He turned to Freya. "Freya, will there be a fight?" She looked at him and answered simply, "There will be." She spoke in that same cool, coaxing tone, almost as if asking what to have for dinner. "Are you afraid?" Her face remained unreadable, cold and composed, as if she were asking a routine question. Regulus had found himself at a loss for words to her more often lately. He didn't want to answer this one. Instead, he thought about that curse from the other night. The disintegration curse actually had 2 forms. Freya's eyes flickered. The first you saw, a gray-green beam, a single-point attack with concentrated power, he said. "You haven't seen the second." She blinked. "The second has no color and no sound. It's an area attack. Its transmission medium is infrasound, inaudible to human ears. Once it spreads, anything within the area is affected." Freya's expression shifted from puzzlement to a slow understanding. An area attack that didn't distinguish between ally and enemy. If he used that form in battle, she would be in the blast radius too. He was warning her in advance. She said nothing, only looked at him with an extra edge of curiosity. Inside, she was already analyzing it. An attack that could be made invisible and inaudible, detectable only by experience or magical perception. Too insidious. She also thought about the way magic bears the mark of the one who creates or uses it. A wizard's signature shows through in their spells. Regulus, she realized, was not entirely the placid surface he presented. Something hidden twined under that composed exterior. Her gaze grew more thoughtful. Regulus, for his part, felt a little unnerved under her scrutiny. He always had the sense she was sizing him up for some flaw. He didn't overthink it. He trusted Freya, carefully, based on their time together, on what she'd said and done. That trust wasn't blind. Grindelwald really knows how to arrange things, he thought with a sigh. The defense is simple, he continued. A shield charm can weaken it, and the bubblehead charm can completely isolate you, provided the bubble covers the entire body. Saying it sounded easy enough. Anyone who survived an encounter and thought it through could figure it out. The problem with this sort of curse was its first strike lethality. If no one knew an invisible, silent killer existed, they wouldn't raise defenses until it was too late. If there's a fight, I'll tell you before I cast it so you can ready your defenses. Freya nodded with more force than before. Sirius. When I cast a spell, I'll tell you too. Regulus waited for more. What spell? How do I defend? Blue fire? But she didn't elaborate. Freya, uncomfortable under his continuing stare, turned her head and looked out to sea. A small dot appeared on the horizon. Gradually, it grew into an island of jagged black reefs, barren of vegetation. A cluster of low gray buildings crouched in the center, blending into the rocks. They'd reached their destination. The boat slowed. The islanders could see them as clearly as they could see the island now. The distance closed quickly, 500 meters, 300, 100. 7 figures took shape in the air ahead of them, hovering about 30 meters from the boat. They wore dark gray robes and bone masks carved with twisted runes. At the front flew the leader. Regulus recognized him, one of the 2 masked men who had fought Freya that night. He had been the leader then too, coordinating the attack and retreat after the other man had been killed by the disintegration curse. The 7 hovered in a loose line, broom tails slanted to steady them. The boat came to a stop. Regulus made no move. This was between Abyssal Whisper and House Eisenhart. Technically, it was Freya's negotiation to handle. His role was that of hired muscle, an external helper the house had engaged. Still, his magic hummed through him. His wand slid into his palm, tip faintly glowing. Ready, but not raised. Freya remained composed, wand lowered at her side. Of the 7, the leader flew forward alone and paused only 5 meters from the bow, an unusually close distance for wizards. He leveled a voice that carried an odd resonant echo, as if coming from a deep chamber. House of Eisenhart, are you really not going to hand over that maritime document? Freya answered coldly, each word measured. There is no precedent for anything belonging to House Eisenhart being handed over under duress. Her bearing was dignified, unyielding, pride in the Eisenhart name and absolute confidence. Regulus watched her. The masked man spoke again, voice flat. Precedent can be broken. We are willing to share the results. The coordinates on that document point to a lost ruin deep beneath the North Sea. If the legends hold, what lies within could change many things. We're not interested, Freya said. You've held it for decades, the masked man pressed. It's been dormant, its value wasted. Don't you think it's a pity? Silence from Freya. We only need to look, confirm the coordinates, open the ruin. Everything inside will be divided equally. House Eisenhart will lose nothing and will instead receive treasure that has lain forgotten. Not interested. Her answer was final. The masked man fell silent for a moment. Why? Freya did not explain. She stood, expressionless, gaze locked on him. There was no room to bargain. The air between them seemed to thicken. Regulus let his mind run through possibilities. That document might be more than a simple maritime log. Coordinates that point to a ruin, deep in the North Sea, beyond ordinary charts, suggested something concealed by powerful enchantment. The ocean was vast. Muggle charts covered only the edges. Wizards, with broomsticks, apparition, portkeys, and tracking magics, could find precise locations, if those locations were marked in some discoverable way. But perhaps the document itself held the secret, an enchantment like a Fidelius charm that only those permitted could perceive. Abyssal Whisper wanted to look to confirm. Regulus suspected they intended to pry whatever seal or secret the paper contained. Negotiations had clearly failed. He prepared to act. The masked man turned his bone-masked face toward him and spoke with the same hollow resonance. And you, The one house Eisenhart hired to muscle for them. What are you going to do?